Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever heard a sound so unnatural it rewrote your understanding of reality? The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as I wiped sweat from my brow, surveying the cattle grazing peacefully across the rolling pastures of Whispering Pines Ranch. The property had been in my family for 4 generations, passed down from my great-grandfather to my grandfather, then to my father, and finally to me, Jackson Miller. I never wanted to be a rancher, but after Dad passed last spring, there was no one else to take over the operation. The first few months had been hard but predictable. Early mornings, physical labor, and the quiet solitude that comes with living 20 miles from the nearest town. I'd settled into a routine, finding unexpected comfort in the rhythmic patterns of ranch life. That routine shattered on Tuesday in late September. I was mending a fence in the north pasture when the wind shifted, carrying with it the low, familiar sound of cattle lowing in the distance. Nothing unusual about that. But then the sound changed, morphed into something that made me drop my hammer mid-swing. My name. Clear as day. Not a word that sounded like my name, not a trick of the wind. My actual name, Jackson, spoken with deliberate precision, the syllables stretched long and unnatural. I stood frozen, listening intently. Nothing but the rustle of dry grass and distant mowing. Had I imagined it? The isolation out here sometimes played tricks on the mind. Shaking it off, I returned to my work, driving nails with perhaps more force than necessary. Just as I convinced myself it was nothing, I heard it again. Jackson. A chill ran through me despite the 100-degree heat. I spun around, scanning the pasture. About 70 yards away stood a cluster of my Black Angus cattle, watching me with unusual stillness. Hello? I called out, feeling immediately foolish. Of course no one answered. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of my name spoken in that inhuman voice kept replaying in my mind. I told myself it was exhaustion, or maybe heat stroke. The alternative, that something on my property could speak, was too absurd to entertain. Morning came after hours of fitful tossing and turning. I dragged myself out of bed before sunrise, as usual, and headed to the kitchen to brew coffee. As I waited for it to percolate, I gazed absently out the window at the misty fields. Something wasn't right. In the pre-dawn light, I could make out a dark shape in the east pasture. Something was on the ground that shouldn't be there. Coffee forgotten, I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and headed out. The grass was heavy with dew as I approached the shape, which slowly revealed itself to be one of my cows. She was lying on her side, unnaturally still. Dead, obviously. Cattle die sometimes, it's an unavoidable part of ranching, but something about this felt different. As I drew closer, my flashlight beam caught something that stopped me cold. The cow's hide had been marked. Not cut or branded in the traditional sense, but altered, as if the black hair had been precisely rearranged to form letters. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized what was written there. My name, Jackson. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. This wasn't possible. The letters were perfectly formed, each stroke precise. No animal could have done this. No person either, not without tools and time and a reason I couldn't begin to fathom. I circled the carcass cautiously. There were no other marks, no obvious cause of death. Just my name displayed prominently on the animal's side like a signature or a warning. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone to call the county sheriff, then hesitated. What would I say? That someone had killed my cow and somehow written my name on it? That I heard cattle speaking? They'd think I was insane. As I stood there deliberating, a sound drifted across the field. Low at first, then clearer. The unmistakable sound of cattle lowing, but wrong somehow, distorted, almost like something trying to imitate the sound without quite getting it right. And underneath it, barely audible, Jackson. I whirled around. Along the fence line, my entire herd stood in perfect formation, heads raised, watching me. In all my years on the ranch, I'd never seen cattle behave this way, unnaturally still and focused, like predators rather than prey. My chest tightened as I backed away slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The nearest building was the old equipment shed, about 30 yards behind me. If I could make it there, I could, what? Hide from my own cattle? The absurdity of my fear struck me, but didn't diminish it. This isn't happening, I whispered to myself, but even as the words left my mouth, the cow began to move. Not charging, but advancing in perfect unison, a synchronized wall of 1,000-pound bodies closing the distance between us with deliberate slowness. And all the while, that sound, my name, repeated over and over, becoming clearer with each utterance, as if whatever was speaking was learning how to form the words more precisely with practice. I turned and ran. The equipment shed offered little comfort as I slammed the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Through gaps in the weathered planks, I watched as the herd stopped about 20 feet from the building, still arranged in that unnatural formation, still watching. Sweat trickled down my back despite the morning chill. I needed to think rationally. There had to be a logical explanation for what was happening. Perhaps someone was playing an elaborate prank, though who would go to such lengths, and why target me? I'd kept mostly to myself since returning to run the ranch. The nearest neighbor, old Ellis Thompson, lived 5 miles down the road and barely had energy to tend his own modest property, let alone orchestrate something like this. As light gradually filled the sky, the cattle began to disperse, returning to their normal grazing patterns as if nothing unusual had occurred. I remained in the shed for another hour, cataloging possible explanations, each more implausible than the last. Finally, when the herd had moved to the far end of the pasture, I made a dash for my truck. I needed an outside perspective. Someone who would listen without immediately assuming I'd lost my mind. The drive into town took 25 minutes, each mile putting distance between me and the inexplicable events at the ranch, allowing my racing thoughts to slow. By the time I reached Oak Ridge's modest main street, I'd almost convinced myself I was overreacting. A dead cow with strange markings could be explained. The voice must have been my imagination, stress-induced auditory hallucinations brought on by grief and isolation. I parked outside Clara's Diner, the unofficial hub of local information. If anything strange was happening in the county, Clara would know about it. The bell jingled as I pushed open the door. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon grease was oddly comforting. A few morning regulars occupied the counter stools, while Clara herself bustled between tables with a coffee pot. Jackson Miller, as I lived and breathed, she exclaimed when she spotted me. Haven't seen you in here since the funeral. I managed a weak smile. Been busy with the ranch. I bet. Sit yourself down, honey. Coffee? I nodded and slid into a booth by the window. Clara poured me a cup, studying my face with motherly concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. Everything all right out at Whispering Pines? Here was my opening. I took a deep breath. Actually, something strange happened this morning. Found one of my cows dead. Oh, that's a shame, Clara said, sympathy creasing her features. But that happens, doesn't it? It wasn't just that. There were markings on it. Clara's eyebrows rose. Markings? Like from a predator? I hesitated. No. Words. My name, specifically. Like someone wrote it there. Clara's expression shifted subtly. Your name? Written out exactly? It's hard to explain. Like the hair had been rearranged somehow. She frowned. You think someone's messing with you? Trespassing on your property? Maybe, I said, but I didn't believe it. Has anyone else mentioned anything unusual happening with their livestock? Clara set down her coffee pot and slid into the seat across from me. She lowered her voice. You know the Harisas out past the old mill? Frank came in here about 2 weeks ago, white as a sheet. Said something had been getting at his sheep. Found 3 of them dead in 1 week. My mouth went dry. Did he say how they died? Clara shook her head. That's the thing. No visible cause. Just dead. But Frank said. She glanced around and leaned closer. He said each one had his name spelled out on it. Thought someone was threatening him, maybe those developers who've been buying up land in the county. My hands gripped the coffee mug so tightly my knuckles turned white. Did he mention hearing anything? Voices, maybe? Clara gave me a strange look. No, nothing like that. Why? Did you hear something? I forced myself to relax my grip. No, just wondering. She didn't look convinced but was distracted by another customer calling for a refill. As she got up, she squeezed my shoulder. You be careful out there, Jackson. Maybe call Sheriff Reed about those markings. I nodded absently, my mind reeling. So I wasn't the only one. Whatever was happening wasn't isolated to Whispering Pines. As I paid my bill, I decided to drive over to the Harris farm. Frank Harris was a stern, practical man not given to hysteria or superstition. If he experienced something similar, maybe together we could make sense of it. The Harris farm lay about 15 miles east of town, even more isolated than my property. Their long gravel driveway was marked by a weathered sign reading Harris Family Farms EST 1952. I pulled up to the modest farmhouse and was surprised to see a for sale sign posted in the front yard. Before I could get out of my truck, the front door opened and Ellen Harris appeared on the porch. Her thin face looked tired, her movements wary as she watched me approach. Mrs. Harris, I called out. It's Jackson Miller. Is Frank around? Something like fear flashed across her features. Frank's not here anymore, Jackson. Oh. When do you expect him back? Ellen's eyes darted nervously past me, scanning the empty driveway as if expecting someone else to appear. He's not coming back. We're selling the place. Moving to be near our daughter in Oklahoma. This was surprising news. The Harisas had been fixtures in the county for generations. I'm sorry to hear that. I was hoping to talk to Frank about something that happened on my ranch. Ellen stepped closer to the edge of the porch, lowering her voice though there was no one else around. Does it have something to do with your animals? I nodded. Found one dead this morning, with my name on it. Clara said Frank had something similar happen. Ellen's face crumpled. Oh God. It's spreading. She glanced behind her at the open door, then back at me. You need to leave, Jackson. Sell the ranch if you can. Get far away from here. What? Why? What's happening? I don't know exactly. It started 3 weeks ago. Just like you said, dead sheep with Frank's name on them. Then we started hearing things. Her voice dropped to a whisper. His name, called out across the fields at night. Frank said it was just the wind, but we both knew better. A chill ran down my spine. Did you ever see what was doing it? Ellen's eyes welled with tears. Frank did. 2 nights ago. He went out to check on the remaining sheep. Said he couldn't sleep with that calling. He was gone for hours. When he came back, she shuddered. He was different. Wouldn't speak. Just started packing our things. Said we had to leave immediately. Where is he now? At her daughter's. I'm just here to finish up with the realtor. She hugged herself tightly. He still won't talk about what he saw, but he wakes up screaming every night. My mouth had gone completely dry. Mrs. Harris, hi. Go home, Jackson, she interrupted, her eyes suddenly fierce with concern. Pack what matters to you and leave. Today. Before it gets worse. Before I could respond, she retreated into the house, closing and locking the door behind her. The drive back to Whispering Pines was a blur of conflicting thoughts. Part of me wanted to follow Ellen's advice, pack up and run. But where would I go? The ranch was all I had left. And what about my cattle? I couldn't just abandon them. As I turned onto the long drive leading to my property, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. In a few hours, it would be dark. And in the gathering shadows along the fence line, my entire herd stood watching, waiting for my return. I parked as close to the house as possible, my eyes never leaving the cattle lined up along the fence. They shouldn't be there. That pasture was supposed to be empty today according to my rotation schedule. Yet there they stood, at least 30 head, motionless except for the occasional swish of a tail. As I cut the engine, the silence pressed in around me. No birds. No insects. Not even the usual creaking of the old windmill that normally provided a constant soundtrack to life at Whispering Pines. Just silence and those watching eyes. I grabbed my shotgun from the rack behind the seat, not that I intended to use it on my own livestock, but its weight provided some comfort. As I walked briskly toward the house, I forced myself not to run. Something instinctual told me that showing fear would be dangerous. Inside, I locked every door and window, then pulled the heavy curtains closed. The house felt different somehow. The familiar rooms now seemed too large, too full of shadows and corners where things could hide. I tried calling Sheriff Reed, but only got his voicemail. I left a message describing the dead cow, but omitted the part about my name appearing on it or the strange behavior of the herd. Even in my current state, I recognized how that would sound. As darkness fell, I sat at the kitchen table cleaning my shotgun by the light of a single lamp, trying to focus on the methodical task rather than the occasional sounds from outside, the low mooing that sometimes seemed almost like words, the scrape of hooves against earth that sounded too coordinated to be random movement. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang, making me jump so violently I nearly knocked the gun off the table. Miller, I answered, hoping it was the sheriff returning my call. There was no response at first, just a static-filled silence. Then, faintly, I heard it, my name, spoken in that same unnatural voice I heard in the field. Jackson. I ended the call immediately, my hand shaking. The number had been blocked. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank. Someone in town who'd heard about my dead cow and decided to have some fun at my expense. But deep down, I knew better. A loud thud against the front door made me nearly jump out of my skin. Then another. Something was striking the door with considerable force. Shotgun in hand, I moved to the window nearest the door and carefully pushed the curtain aside just enough to peek out. One of my Angus bulls stood on the porch, its massive head lowered. As I watched, it reared back and slammed its forehead against the door again. The heavy oak shuddered but held. This was impossible. Cattle don't behave this way. They certainly don't mount steps onto a porch and deliberately ram a door. Yet there it was, preparing to charge again. I moved to a better vantage point and realized with growing horror that the entire herd had surrounded the house. In the pale moonlight, I could see them positioned at every window, every potential exit, their eyes reflecting an unnatural gleam. My phone rang again. Blocked number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Who is this? I demanded. A sound like static or distant wind came through the speaker, then cleared into something resembling a voice, or rather, many voices layered on top of each other, speaking in unsettling unison. We know your name, Jackson Miller. Ice flooded my veins. What do you want? To be heard. To be known. To be named. I don't understand. A pause. You will. Then, more disturbingly, we're coming inside now, Jackson. The line went dead. Simultaneously, the thudding at the door intensified, joined by similar impacts at the windows and even on the roof. The entire house seemed to shake with their coordinated assault. I backed into the center of the living room, shotgun raised. The logical part of my brain scrambled for explanations, rabies, some toxin in the water supply, even some kind of mass hysteria affecting the animals. But none of those explained the voice on the phone or my name appearing on the dead cow. A window shattered in the kitchen. I heard the heavy thud of hooves on the tile floor. Stay back. I shouted, though I knew it was absurd to think the cattle would obey verbal commands. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly. My breath fogged in front of me as I pivoted slowly, trying to watch all entrances at once. The lamp flickered, then went out altogether, plunging the room into darkness. The sound of breathing, deep, heavy, unmistakably bovine, came from multiple directions at once. My eyes hadn't adjusted to the darkness yet, but I could sense movement all around me. What are you? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. We are the unnamed, came the reply, directly behind me. That same voice from the phone, multiple voices speaking as one. We are the forgotten. We are the consumed. I spun around, but saw nothing. The darkness seemed to shift and move like a living thing. I don't understand, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. You speak our name when you count us, the voice continued. You speak our name when you brand us. You speak our name when you slaughter us. But you never let us speak yours. A chill ran down my spine as comprehension began to dawn. You're saying you're the cattle? That's impossible. Not the cattle, the voice corrected. What lives in the cattle? What has always lived in the cattle? In all the animals you name but never truly see. The temperature dropped further. Frost began to form on the furniture, on the walls, crackling across the wooden floorboards. I could see my surroundings now by the faint glow of moonlight reflecting off the ice. And I could see them, dark shapes moving against the darkness, not quite solid, not quite vapor. They had the general form of cattle, but were wrong somehow, distorted, as if seen through rippling water. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "To be acknowledged. To be witnessed. To be named in return." The shapes began to circle me, moving with a fluid grace that no earthly cow could possess. The air grew so cold it burned my lungs with each breath. "I don't know your name," I said desperately. "How can I name you if I don't know what you are?" The circling shapes paused. Then, slowly, they began to coalesce, merging into a single, larger form. No longer bovine, it towered over me, its features constantly shifting and reforming. "Then we will show you," it said, its voice now singular but no less terrifying. "We will show you what we are." It reached for me with appendages that were neither arms nor legs, but something else entirely. I raised the shotgun and fired, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. The shot passed through the entity without resistance, splintering the wall behind it. The creature didn't even flinch. "Your weapons cannot harm us, Jackson Miller," it said, almost sadly. "We are not of your world." Its touch, when it came, was like being submerged in ice water. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't scream. My vision darkened at the edges as the cold penetrated deeper, reaching into my very core. And then, abruptly, I was elsewhere. Not physically, my body remained in the living room, but my mind, my consciousness, was transported. I saw vast, endless plains under an alien sky. Herds of creatures that resembled cattle but weren't quite right, moving in patterns that seemed to form complex symbols across the landscape. I saw beings of light and shadow communing with these herds, their thoughts connecting in ways I couldn't comprehend. And I saw the moment when something tore through the fabric of that reality, a rift, a doorway, a breach. I saw these entities pouring through, frightened and confused, seeking refuge in the closest analogs they could find in our world. Cattle. Sheep. Animals that moved in herds that could harbor these displaced consciousnesses. The vision shifted. I saw generations of these entities trapped in the bodies of Earth's animals, watching as humans domesticated them, bred them, slaughtered them. Unable to communicate, unable to return home, gradually forgetting what they had once been. Until now. The vision ended as suddenly as it had begun. I found myself on my knees in the living room, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling with cold and shock. The entity stood before me, its form slightly more stable now, almost recognizable as something that had once been cattle-like but had evolved, or devolved, into something else entirely. "Now you know," it said. "Now you have witnessed. Now you must name us." My mind reeled. I don't know what to call you. I don't have a name for what you are." "Then give us one," it insisted. "Name us as you name all things you claim ownership over." Understanding dawned on me. This wasn't about what I called them. It was about the act of naming itself, the power dynamic it represented. These entities, whatever they were, had been subjugated not just physically but linguistically, denied the agency to name themselves or those who controlled them. "You don't need me to name you," I said slowly. "You already have a name. Your own name." The entity grew still. "We have forgotten it. Too long in your world, in your animals. We remember only fragments." "Then remember," I urged, not entirely sure why I was encouraging this terrifying presence. Remember who you were before. Name yourselves. The temperature in the room began to rise slightly. The entity's form wavered, becoming less substantial. We cannot, it said, and for the first time, I heard something like sorrow in its voice. Too much has been lost. Too much has changed. We are neither what we were nor what we inhabit. A thought occurred to me, a desperate, possibly foolish idea. Then let me hear your name, I said. Not give it to you, but hear it from you. Speak it, and I will witness it. The entity seemed to consider this. Then, slowly, it began to make a sound, not words, not even vocalization as I understood it, but something deeper, more primal. A resonance that I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. It lasted only moments, but in that time, I understood something fundamental about these beings. They weren't evil, weren't malevolent. They were lost, confused, gradually warped by centuries of imprisonment in forms not their own. When the sound ended, the entity remained, but its presence had changed. Less threatening, more waiting. I heard you, I said softly. I witnessed your name. And now we must witness yours, it replied. Not as a marking, not as a claim, but freely given. I understood then. The dead animals with names written on them, they weren't threats. They were attempts at communication and establishing a reciprocal relationship. Crude and frightening, yes, but born of desperation rather than malice. My name is Jackson Miller, I said clearly. I speak it to you freely, without claim or dominion. The entity seemed to exhale, though it had no lungs. Witnessed, it said simply. And then, more quietly, enough for now. It began to dissipate, breaking apart into smaller wisps that drifted toward the broken window. As they passed, one brushed against my cheek, cold, but not the bone-deep chill from before. Almost gentle. Will you come back? I asked, not sure why I wanted to know. The last of the entity paused at the window. We have always been here, Jackson Miller. We will always be here. But now, perhaps, we can speak instead of simply being spoken for. And then it was gone, melting into the night. Outside, I heard the normal sounds of cattle, lowing, shifting, breathing, resume as if nothing unusual had happened. I remained on my knees for a long time, trying to process what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to flee, to follow Ellen Harris's advice and never return to this place. But another part, the part that had glimpsed something ancient and profound, knew I couldn't leave. Not now. Not when I'd only just begun to understand. Whatever these entities were, whatever they wanted, they had chosen to reveal themselves to me. And in doing so, they had irrevocably changed my understanding of the world and my place in it. I rose unsteadily to my feet, went to the broken window, and looked out at my herd. They appeared normal now, some grazing despite the late hour, others resting on the ground. But I knew better. I knew that watching eyes were upon me, not just animal eyes, but something else. Something that now knew my name, just as I had witnessed theirs. The question was, what would happen next? I didn't sleep that night. How could I, with the window broken and the memory of that entity's touch still lingering on my skin? Instead, I sat in the kitchen with a pot of coffee growing progressively more bitter, watching the sunrise paint the fields in gold and trying to make sense of what had happened. By morning light, it all seemed impossible, a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. The cattle were behaving normally again, grazing peacefully in the distance. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was the broken window and the frost damage to my living room furniture, and the dead cow with my name on it, which still lay in the east pasture. I needed to dispose of it. That much was clear. Whether last night's events were real or imagined, I couldn't leave the carcass to rot and attract predators. After a quick breakfast I couldn't taste, I drove the tractor out to where the cow lay. In the harsh morning light, the marking on its side seemed even more deliberate, more precise. My name, spelled out in black against black, visible only because of the way the hairs had been arranged to catch the light differently. I attached chains to drag the carcass to the far corner of the property where I dug a pit for such purposes. As the tractor lurched forward, pulling the dead weight behind it, I found myself speaking aloud. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to, the cow, the entity that had inhabited it, or some combination of the two. The disposal was quick but grim work. As I covered the carcass with soil, I felt an uncomfortable awareness of being watched, though the nearest cattle were hundreds of yards away. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, assessing, judging. When I finished, I stood by the freshly turned earth and spoke again. "I witnessed what happened here," I said, the words feeling both foolish and necessary. "I acknowledge your presence." No response came, no voice, no sudden appearance of the entity from last night. Just the whisper of wind through dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound, scrutinizing every movement from the herd. But nothing unusual occurred. I patched the broken window with plywood until I could get into town for proper repairs, and tried to settle back into my routine. That evening, as dusk fell, my phone rang. The number was local, Sheriff Reed returning my call at last. "Miller," he said when I answered, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Got your message about the dead cow. Any idea what killed it?" I hesitated. "No visible wounds. Might have been something internal." He sounded skeptical. "You didn't mention anything about markings in your message, but Ellen Harris called me this morning. Said you stopped by yesterday asking about the same thing happening to Frank's sheep." My grip tightened on the phone. "Did she tell you what Frank saw? The night before they left?" A pause. "No. She just said you might be in trouble and I should check on you." Another pause. "You want to tell me what's really going on out there, Jackson?" I closed my eyes, considering my options. If I told him the truth about the voice, the entity, the impossible events of last night, he'd think I was having some kind of breakdown. But if I said nothing and things escalated again, "I think someone might be trespassing," I said finally, choosing a middle ground. "Messing with the livestock. Maybe trying to scare me off the property." "Any idea who'd want to do that?" "No. I've kept to myself since coming back." Reed was silent for a moment. "Those developers haven't been by? The ones from Phoenix?" This was news to me. "What developers?" "Group called Horizon Partners. They've been buying up ranches all over the county, offering good money, from what I hear. They approached Frank Harris about 2 weeks before all this started happening with his sheep." My mind raced. Could there be a connection? Could someone be using elaborate scare tactics to drive down property values or frighten owners into selling? It seemed far-fetched. Who would go to such lengths? But it was still more plausible than entities from another reality inhabiting my cattle. "No," I said. "No one's approached me about buying the ranch." "Well, keep an eye out." "And Jackson?" Maybe get yourself a security camera or two. If someone is trespassing, we need evidence to do anything about it. Will do, Sheriff. Thanks. After hanging up, I found myself staring out the window at the darkening fields. The security camera idea wasn't bad, but I doubted it would capture what I'd experienced. Still, it might provide some answers. As night fell fully, I tensed, half expecting the cattle to resume their unnatural behavior. But the hours passed quietly. Too quietly, perhaps. The normal sounds of the ranch at night seemed muffled, distant. Around midnight, unable to sleep, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the living room window, I noticed something odd, a faint blue glow emanating from the direction of the cattle pens. Curiosity overrode caution. I grabbed my shotgun and a flashlight and headed outside. The night air was unusually cold for Texas, my breath fogging in front of me as I walked toward the source of the light. It seemed to be coming from the old barn where I kept feed and equipment. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of that strange blue light spilling out. I approached cautiously, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. "Who's there?" No response. I pushed the door open wider with the barrel of my shotgun. The interior of the barn was transformed. The blue light emanated from what looked like tiny stars suspended in the air, thousands of them, forming complex patterns that shifted and realigned as I watched. In the center of the barn stood a single cow, or something that resembled a cow. Its form wavered and flickered, sometimes solid, sometimes transparent. The blue light seemed to orbit it, occasionally passing through its body without resistance. "We are remembering," said a voice, that same multi-layer voice from the night before, but softer now, almost contemplative. I stepped fully into the barn, my fear tempered by a strange sense of wonder. Remembering what? Home. What we were. What we lost. The entity's form shifted, becoming more defined, more deliberate in its movements. Your words helped unlock what was forgotten. My words? You acknowledged us. You witnessed our name. It has been a very long time since any human did so. I lowered my shotgun, recognizing its uselessness in this situation. The others, Frank Harris, the other ranchers. Did you try to communicate with them too? Yes. But they reacted with fear only. They did not listen. They did not witness. You scared them, I pointed out. Finding dead animals with their names written on them, what did you expect? The entity's form rippled, as if disturbed by my words. We are not skilled in your modes of communication. We used what we knew. Names written on flesh, it is how you mark your ownership of us. I frowned. The branding, you mean? That's for identification, not ownership. The distinction is meaningless to us. You mark. You name. You claim. The blue lights pulse brighter, their patterns becoming more frantic. The temperature in the barn dropped further. You're angry, I observed, taking a step back. Not angry. Remembering. Feeling. We have been dormant for too long. Fragmented. Scattered among many hosts. Now we are coalescing again. Now we remember purpose. Something in its tone made me uneasy. What purpose? The entity's form expanded slightly, but blue light swirling faster around it. To return home. To open the way that was closed. You can go back? I asked, surprised. To wherever you came from? Perhaps. The path was sealed long ago, but now we remember how it might be reopened. I should have felt relief at this news. If these entities could return to their own realm, they would leave my cattle, leave this world behind. Yet something in the way the blue lights pulsed, in the way the temperature continued to drop, gave me pause. What would that take? To open this path? The entities seemed to hesitate. Energy. Tremendous energy. And anchors. Points of connection between realms. What kind of anchors? Those who have witnessed. Those who have named and been named in return. Its form shifted, temporarily taking on more recognizable bovine shape before dissolving back into its fluid state. Those like you, Jackson Miller. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through me. What do you mean, those like me? You have been marked. You have witnessed our true name. You are connected now. The implications slowly dawned on me. You need me to open this path? To be some kind of sacrifice? The blue lights flared. Not sacrifice. Conduit. Channel. The energy must flow through connection points. Through beings that exist in both awareness states. I took another step back. And what happens to these conduits when this path opens? Again, that hesitation. Unknown. The process has not been attempted for generations beyond counting. But you're willing to risk it. Risk me. We have been trapped here for thousands of your years, the entity said, its many-layered voice taking on an edge of desperation. Watching our hosts be born, bred, slaughtered. Fragments of consciousness passed down through bloodlines, never whole, never free. Would you not risk much to escape such an existence? Put that way, I could almost sympathize. Almost. There must be another way, I said. One that doesn't involve using humans as conduits. The entity's form contracted, the blue lights dimming slightly. Perhaps. But it would take much longer. More time spent fragmented. More suffering. I need time to think about this, I said, backing toward the door. This is a lot to process. Time grows short, the entity warned. We are not alone in our awakening. Others remember now, across many places. The convergence approaches. Others? You mean in other cattle? Other ranches? Yes. All connected. All remembering together. That explained Frank Harris's experience and possibly others I hadn't heard about yet. This wasn't isolated to my ranch. It was spreading. Give me until tomorrow night, I said. I need to understand more before I agree to anything. The entity was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, the blue lights began to fade, their patterns dispersing. Until tomorrow, it agreed. But know this, Jackson Miller, the remembering cannot be undone. What has awakened will not return to sleep. With that, the lights winked out completely, plunging the barn into darkness. When I switched on my flashlight, all I saw was an ordinary cow standing placidly in the center of the space, chewing cud as if nothing unusual had occurred. I backed out of the barn and secured the door, my mind racing. Something larger was happening, something that stretched beyond Whispering Pines, beyond even the county lines. And somehow, I was at the center of it. I needed more information. And I knew just where to start looking. The county library opened at 9. I was waiting outside the doors at 8:50, having barely slept. The librarian, Mrs. Winters, raised her eyebrows in surprise when she saw me. "Jackson Miller," she said as she unlocked the doors. "Haven't seen you in here since high school. What brings you to the library so early?" "Research," I said vaguely. "Local history, mostly. And maybe some mythology." Her expression brightened. "Well, you've come to the right place. Anything specific you're looking for?" I hesitated. How to phrase this without sounding completely unhinged? "I'm interested in any local legends about cattle," I said finally. "Or any unusual phenomena reported by ranchers in the area. Historical accounts, newspaper archives, that sort of thing." Mrs. Winters gave me a curious look but didn't press. "We have quite an extensive local history section. The newspaper archives go back to 1887, and we have some journals and diaries from settlers that are even older. As for mythology," she tapped her chin thoughtfully, "we have a decent folklore section. Some Native American legends from the tribes that lived in this region." "That would be perfect," I said. "I appreciate your help." She led me to the relevant sections, and I spent the next several hours poring over yellow newspaper clippings, county histories, and dusty folklore collections. Most of it was mundane, accounts of drought years, cattle drives, land disputes. But here and there, I found something intriguing. A newspaper article from 1923 described a mass hysteria among cattle across 3 counties. Ranchers reported their herds behaving strangely, refusing to eat, and standing in unusual formations. Several ranchers abandoned their properties, claiming the land was cursed. A settler's journal from 1856 mentioned unnatural sounds coming from his small herd at night, as if the beasts were attempting speech. He eventually shot all his cattle and moved east, convinced they were possessed by evil spirits. Most compelling was a transcription of a Comanche legend about shadow beings that came from the stars and inhabited the buffalo herds. According to the legend, these entities could only be seen by those who had been named by the herd and were seeking a way to return to the sky. I was so absorbed in my research that I didn't notice someone approach until they spoke. "Finding what you're looking for?" I startled, looking up to see a woman about my age, with dark hair streaked with gray and keen eyes that seemed to look right through me. Something about her was vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "But Mrs. Winters mentioned you were researching local cattle phenomena." She glanced at the open books and papers spread before me. "That's something of a specialty of mine." I studied her warily. "And you are?" "Diana Blackwood." She extended her hand. "I teach anthropology at the community college. Specifically, I study folklore related to domesticated animals." I shook her hand, still cautious. "Jackson Miller. I run Whispering Pines Ranch." "I know who you are," she said with a slight smile. "This is a small community, and your family has been here for generations." "Just like mine." The name finally clicked. "Blackwood, any relation to Margaret Blackwood?" "She had a small place bordering the northwest corner of our property when I was a kid." My grandmother, Diana, confirmed. "She used to tell me stories about strange things she'd witnessed on that land. Things involving cattle." My pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" Diana glanced around the quiet library, then lowered her voice. "The kind of things you don't talk about if you want people to think you're sane." She tapped the open book in front of me, the one with the Comanche legend. "The kind of things that sound an awful lot like what you're researching. I closed the book, suddenly wary. What makes you think I'm not just doing historical research for a blog post or something? She gave me a knowing look. Because most people doing casual research don't look like they haven't slept in days. And they don't usually focus so specifically on accounts of cattle behaving unnaturally. Her expression softened. Something's happening at your ranch, isn't it? Something you can't explain? The temptation to confide in someone, anyone, who might understand was overwhelming. But caution held me back. What exactly did your grandmother see? I asked instead of answering. Diana studied me for a moment longer, then seemed to come to a decision. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal. This was hers, she said, placing it on the table between us. She started it in 1952 and kept it until she died in 1998. 46 years of observations. She tapped the cover. Most of it sounds like the ravings of a madwoman. But after what I've been seeing myself lately, I'm not so sure. You've been seeing things too? I asked, unable to keep the eagerness from my voice. Not me directly, but I've been collecting accounts from across the county. Frank Harris wasn't the only one to experience something strange before he left. At least 5 other ranching families have abandoned their properties in the last month. She leaned forward. And in every case, it started with their names appearing on dead livestock. I swallowed hard. And then voices? Her eyes widened slightly. So it is happening to you. I hesitated, then nodded once. Have they told you what they want? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. To go home, I said simply. They want to open some kind of path back to wherever they came from. Diana's expression turned grave. That's what I was afraid of. She pushed the journal toward me. You need to read this. My grandmother documented a similar event in 1967. It didn't end well. I placed my hand on the journal but didn't open it yet. Why are you helping me? Why not just leave, like the others? Because running doesn't solve the problem, she said firmly. These entities, whatever they are, have been here for centuries. They're not going away. And from what I've gathered, their attempts to communicate are growing more frequent and more desperate. You think they're building towards something. I know they are, she replied. And so do you, or you wouldn't be here researching their history. She was right. The entity in my barn had mentioned a convergence, others awakening across many places. This was bigger than just my ranch, bigger than just our county. What do you suggest we do? I asked. Diana glanced at her watch. First, read that journal. Then meet me at Blackwood Creek, the spot where my grandmother's property bordered yours. There's something there you need to see. She stood. 8 o'clock tonight. What? Just be there, she interrupted. And Jackson? Come along. These entities, they don't like crowds. Before I could ask anything else, she was gone, striding purposefully toward the exit. I looked down at the journal in my hands, feeling like I was holding something dangerous yet invaluable. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, devouring Margaret Blackwood's journal. The early entries were mundane observations about weather and livestock management. But around 1965, the tone changed. She began documenting strange behavior in her small herd of cattle, unnatural stillness, coordinated movements, unusual vocalizations. Then came the names. First, She found Margaret spelled out in the arrangement of hair on a dead calf. Then voices calling her name across the fields at night. Her descriptions matched what I had experienced with eerie precision. But it was the entries from June 1967 that truly chilled me. Margaret wrote about meeting with several other ranchers who had experienced similar phenomena. Together, they had encountered an entity that offered to show them the way home in exchange for their assistance. 3 of the ranchers agreed to help. Margaret refused. The final entry from that period, dated June 17, 1967, was brief but haunting. They attempted the ritual last night at the Old Creek crossing. Something went wrong. The light was blinding, visible for miles. When I arrived, there was nothing left of Davis, Thompson, or Alvarez, just scorched earth and cattle standing in a perfect circle, watching me. Whatever door they tried to open, it consumed them instead of providing passage. I fear the entities are still here, still waiting for another opportunity. God help us all if they find it. The journal continued after that, but the entries returned to normal ranch observations. Whatever had happened at Blackwood Creek, Margaret never wrote about the entities again. By the time I finished reading, the library was closing. Mrs. Winters had to gently remind me twice that it was time to leave. I asked if I could borrow the journal, but she explained that Diana had only left it temporarily and would be returning for it. As I drove back to Whispering Pines, my mind raced with questions. What exactly had happened in 1967? What had gone wrong with the ritual? And most importantly, what did Diana want to show me at the creek tonight? I arrived back at the ranch just as dusk was falling. The cattle were grazing peacefully, showing no signs of unusual behavior. But now I looked at them differently, wondering which ones might be harboring fragments of these ancient, displaced entities. After a quick meal I couldn't taste, I grabbed my jacket, flashlight, and, after some hesitation, my shotgun. Margaret's journal had made it clear that these entities weren't necessarily malevolent, but they were dangerous, especially when desperate. The spot where Blackwood Creek crossed the boundary between our properties was about a mile from the main house, accessible by a seldom-used trail that wound through a stand of oak trees. As I walked, the night seemed to close in around me, the familiar sounds of the ranch fading into an expectant silence. The creek itself was little more than a trickle most of the year, cutting a shallow ravine through the landscape. As I approached, I saw a figure already waiting, Diana, silhouetted against the faint glow of a small lantern. "You came," she said as I drew near, sounding relieved. "And you read the journal?" I nodded. "What happened here in 1967? Your grandmother wasn't entirely clear." Diana picked up the lantern and gestured for me to follow her. "Better if I show you." She led me along the creek bank for about 50 yards, then stopped at a flat area where the ravine widened slightly. Even in the dim light, I could see that the ground here was different, darker, almost glassy in places. "This earth was vitrified," Diana said, shining the lantern on the hardened soil. "Heated to such extreme temperatures that it turned to glass." The official explanation was a lightning strike, but there were no storms that night. I crouched down, running my fingers over the smooth, unnatural surface. "This is where they tried to open the path." "Yes. Using themselves as conduits, just as they're asking of you." She swept the light in a circle, illuminating the entire area. Nothing grew here for decades. No plants, no insects, nothing. Like the land itself was dead. I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands. "Your grandmother's journal said 3 men disappeared. Were their bodies ever found?" Diana shook her head. "No. They were simply gone, The official report listed them as missing, presumed drowned in flash flooding. But locals knew better. She set the lantern down and faced me directly. The entities tried to use them to force open a path that wasn't ready to be opened. It backfired. Spectacularly. And you think they're trying again now? I know they are. But something's different this time. She looked up at the night sky, her expression troubled. The stars are aligning differently. Literally. I followed her gaze. The stars looked the same as always to me, but I wasn't an astronomer. There's a specific configuration they need, Diana continued. A cosmic alignment that only occurs once every 60 years or so. My grandmother documented it, though she didn't understand its significance at the time. And this alignment is happening now? Tomorrow night, she said gravely. That's why there's been such a sudden increase in activity. That's why they're reaching out to more and more ranchers, desperately seeking those who will listen, who will help. I thought about the entity in my barn, its plea for assistance. They told me they need me as a conduit. That had been marked because I witnessed their true name. Diana's eyes widened. You heard their name? Their actual name? I think so. It wasn't words, exactly. More like a vibration, a resonance. That's significant, Jackson. Very significant. In all my grandmother's research, she never found anyone who had heard their true name and survived with their sanity intact. She studied me with new interest. What did it sound like? I tried to describe the sound, the bone-deep resonance, the layered tones that seemed to exist both within and beyond normal hearing. Diana listened intently, occasionally nodding. That matches some of the descriptions from much older accounts, she said when I finished. From before European settlement. The Comanche called them star spirits or the voices in the herd. They believed these entities were sacred messengers stranded here when the pathway between worlds closed. So what do we do? I asked. Help them open this path? After what happened last time? Diana shook her head. I don't think we have a simple choice between helping or not helping. They're going to attempt the ritual with or without willing participants. The question is whether we can ensure it's done correctly this time. And how do we do that? My grandmother spent decades studying this phenomenon after the 1967 incident. She believed the ritual failed because it was incomplete. The entities were missing crucial components. Diana picked up the lantern again. Come on. There's more I need to show you. She led me further along the creek to a small cave in the ravine wall I'd never noticed before. Inside, the walls were covered with faded pictographs, ancient images of cow-like creatures surrounded by strange symbols. These are at least 5,000 years old, Diana said, holding the lantern up to illuminate the drawings. The entities have been here much longer than we realized. And they've tried to leave many times. I studied the images. They showed humanoid figures arranged in specific patterns around the cow-like beings, with lines connecting them like a circuit. These figures, I said, pointing. They're the conduits? Yes. But notice how many there are. 7. In 1967, there were only 3 ranchers involved. The circuit was incomplete. Understanding dawned on me. They need 7 people. 7 conduits. Diana nodded grimly. And they need them to be willing. To truly witness and acknowledge the entities. That's why forcing or tricking people into participating won't work. So we need to find 4 more people who've had similar experiences? who've heard their name? 3 more, Diana corrected. I've heard it too. Last week, in my grandmother's old barn. That's why I was collecting accounts, trying to find others before it was too late. I stared at her in disbelief. And you're willing to be a conduit? After what happened to those men in 1967? I believe we can do it right this time, she said with quiet conviction. And I believe the consequences of not helping could be worse. These entities are growing desperate. If they can't open the path, they might try something more drastic, I finished. We spent the next hour discussing possibilities. Diana had been tracking reports of strange livestock behavior across the county and had identified 2 other ranchers who might have had similar experiences, Elena Vasquez and Jim Whitaker. Both were still on their properties, unlike Frank Harris and the others who had fled. We need to convince them to join us, Diana said as we walked back toward the main trail. And we need to do it by tomorrow night. And if they refuse? She looked at me gravely. Then we face a choice. Either we abandon the ritual entirely, or we try with fewer conduits and hope for the best. Neither option sounds promising. No, she agreed. But doing nothing is no longer an option. As we reached the spot where our paths would diverge, Diana handed me a small leather pouch. My grandmother made this as protection. It won't stop the entities, but it might shield you from the worst of their influence if things go wrong. I took the pouch, feeling its weight in my palm. What's in it? Materials from both worlds. Soil from the vitrified ground, herbs she grew in that soil, and a few other things she never specified. Diana's expression was solemn. We're it tomorrow night, no matter what happens. After she left, I stood for a long time at the edge of my property, staring up at the stars and wondering if they truly were aligning for some cosmic event I couldn't comprehend. The weight of the decision before me was staggering. Help these entities attempt a ritual that had killed 3 men 60 years ago, or risk the consequences of their growing desperation. When I finally returned to the ranch house, I found my cattle gathered in the yard, standing in a perfect circle under the moonlight. At the center lay a dead calf, its body arranged in a pattern that matched the pictographs in the cave. The message was clear. Time was running out. Chapter 6. Morning brought a sense of urgency unlike anything I'd experienced before. The dead calf was gone, whether removed by the entities or dragged away by predators, I couldn't say. But its message lingered, a countdown ticking away in my mind. I called Diana as soon as the sun rose, confirming our plan to approach the other potential conduits. She would visit Elena Vasquez's small goat farm on the eastern edge of the county, while I would drive to Jim Whitaker's ranch about 10 miles south of my property. Jim was a gruff man in his 60s who had always kept to himself. I'd encountered him occasionally at livestock auctions over the years, but couldn't claim to know him well. As I pulled up to his modest ranch house, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. His fields were overgrown, his cattle thin and restless. He answered the door with a shotgun in hand, his eyes bloodshot and wary. "Miller? What do you want?" I raised my hand slowly. "Just to talk, Jim. About what's been happening with your cattle." His expression tightened. "Nothing's happening with my cattle. They're fine." "The markings," I pressed. "The voices. I know about them because it's happening to me too." The shotgun lowered slightly. "You're hearing them?" "Yes. And I'm not the only one." Jim's withered face seemed to age 10 years in an instant. He stepped back, gesturing for me to enter. "You'd better come inside." His living room was a chaos of empty whiskey bottles, scattered papers, and strange symbols drawn on the walls in what looked like charcoal. He noticed my gaze and grimaced. "Been trying to keep them out," he explained. "Doesn't work worth a damn." "The entities," I said. "They've been trying to communicate with you." Jim collapsed into a worn armchair. "That what they are? Entities?" I thought I was losing my mind. "They're real," I assured him. "They've been here for thousands of years, trapped in our livestock. And now they're trying to go home." I explained everything, the entity's origin, their desperate attempts to open a path back to their dimension, the ritual that had failed in 1967, and the alignment happening tonight. Jim listened in silence, occasionally taking swigs from a half-empty bottle of whiskey. "So you're saying they need 7 of us," he said when I finished. "7 crazy folks who've heard their true name. We have 4 so far, including you. Diana's trying to convince Elena Vasquez to be the 5th. Jim laughed bitterly. "And if we help them? What's to stop us from ending up like those poor bastards in 67? "Nothing," I admitted. "Except that we think we know what went wrong last time. The circuit was incomplete. They only had 3 conduits when they needed 7. And if we don't help?" I hesitated. "They're getting desperate. More aggressive. Whatever happens if we refuse, I don't think it ends well for any of us." Jim was silent for a long time, staring at the symbols he'd drawn on his walls. Finally, he sighed. "Hell, Miller. I haven't had a decent night's sleep in weeks. If there's even a chance this might end it." He nodded slowly. "I'm in." Relief flooded through me. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said grimly. "We're still short 2 conduits." As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Diana, her voice tight with excitement. "Elena's in. And she knows another, Marion Chen. She runs the organic farm on Highway 16. She's been experiencing the same things." "That's 6, I said, heart racing. "We're still 1 short." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I think I know who the 7th might be. But you're not going to like it." "Who?" "Frank Harris." My stomach dropped. "But he's gone. Left town." "His wife is gone," Diana corrected. "Frank came back yesterday. Elena saw him at the feed store, looking half dead and talking to himself. She said he kept muttering about voices calling him home." I exchanged a look with Jim, who nodded grimly. "We need to find him." "Meet me at the old Blackwood Creek crossing at sunset," Diana said. "I'll try to locate Frank and bring him there." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Jim and I visited the crossing, marking out the positions described in the ancient pictographs. 7 points in a perfect circle, with spaces for the cattle, or the entities, at the center. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, we gathered at the creek. Diana arrived with Elena Vasquez, a tough-looking woman in her 40s, and Marion Chen, a younger woman with tired eyes and a determined set to her jaw. Each carried a small token, a cowbell, a piece of branded hide, a carved wooden figure of a bull. "The entities instructed us to bring these," Diana explained. "They're connecting objects, things that have been named or marked by both worlds." I nodded, touching the leather pouch Diana had given me, now hanging around my neck. "Any sign of Frank?" "Not yet," Diana admitted. "But there's still time." As darkness fell, a strange stillness settled over the land. The creek, usually a gentle murmur, went silent. The wind died completely. Even the insects ceased their chirping. "They're coming," Elena whispered. From all directions, cow began to emerge from the shadows, not just mine, but animals from every property for miles around. They moved with unnatural coordination, forming concentric circles around the ritual site. Then, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. Frank Harris, his clothes dirty and torn, his eyes wild but focused. Without a word, he walked to the empty position in our circle. "You heard them too," I said softly. Frank nodded, his first acknowledgement. "Never stopped hearing them. Even in Oklahoma. They called me back." With all 7 conduits present, the entities made their move. The cattle closest to the center began to change, their forms shimmering, melting into those same fluid shapes I'd seen in my barn. Blue lights appeared, first a few, then thousands, surrounding us in a swirling galaxy of tiny stars. "The alignment has begun," Diana announced, her voice steady despite the impossible scene unfolding around us. "Remember the instructions. When they speak their true name, we must speak ours in return. Complete the circuit. Don't break the connection, no matter what happens." The blue lights intensified, spinning faster, generating a low hum that vibrated through the ground beneath our feet. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on the grass despite the warm September night. And then, the voice, that same multi-layered, resonant voice I'd heard before, but amplified, coming from everywhere at once. "We are ready," it said. "The way opens. The stars align. Will you witness?" "We will witness," we responded in unison. The circle of lights contracted, focusing on the center point. The cow-shaped entities began to merge, forming a single, massive presence that towered over us. Its form shifted constantly, sometimes appearing almost human, sometimes entirely alien. "Speak your names," it commanded. "Speak them freely, not as markers or claims, but as recognition of existence." One by one, we did so. Diana, Elena, Marion, Jim, Frank. When it came to me, I hesitated only briefly before speaking clearly. "Jackson Miller. I witness you." The entities seemed to expand, stretching upward into the night sky. "And now, we speak ours." What followed was not a sound that human ears could truly comprehend. It was a resonance, a vibration that seemed to exist on multiple planes simultaneously. It passed through us, into us, becoming part of us for that brief, eternal moment. The ground beneath us began to glow, the vitrified soil from the failed ritual 60 years ago coming alive with inner light. The blue stars spun faster, creating a vortex above the center of our circle. The air itself seemed to thin, to tear, revealing glimpses of somewhere else, a world of vast plains under an alien sky. "The path opens," the entity announced, its voice now singular, clarified. "We can return. But the passage requires energy. Your energy. Freely given." I felt it then, a drawing sensation, as if something essential was being pulled from my body. Not painful, but intense, overwhelming. Around me, the others swayed, their faces illuminated by the blue light, expressions of awe and fear mingling. "It's too much," Marion gasped. "We can't." "Hold on," Diana urged. "The connection must remain intact." Frank suddenly dropped to his knees, blood trickling from his nose. "I've been hearing them for so long," he whispered. "So long." The entity noticed his distress. The one called Frank Harris is failing. His essence is already partially translated. He cannot sustain the connection. What does that mean? I demanded, fighting to remain standing as the drawing sensation intensified. It means, Diana said grimly, that Frank has been between worlds since his first encounter. He's already half gone. Frank looked up, his eyes clearing momentarily. I saw them, he said, that night in the pasture. I saw their home. It's beautiful. Blood now streamed from his ears as well. I want to go there. Frank, no! I reached for him, but the blue light between us made it impossible to cross the circle. The circuit is breaking, the entity warned. The path becomes unstable. The vortex above us began to wobble, the glimpses of the other world flickering erratically. Energy crackled across the ritual site, raising the hair on our arms. We must stabilize the connection, the entity declared. One must serve as anchor. One must remain behind. What does that mean? Elena demanded. One of you must take the place of what we leave behind, the entity explained. A consciousness to inhabit the vessels we abandon, to maintain the balance between worlds. Understanding dawned on me. Someone has to stay behind and live in the cattle? Become like you've been? Yes, the entity confirmed. A willing sacrifice. A conscious choice. The vortex spun more wildly, energy arcing dangerously around us. Frank collapsed completely, blood now covering his face. Decide quickly, the entity urged. The alignment fades. Without hesitation, Frank raised his hand. I'll do it, he said, his voice suddenly stronger. I'm already out there anyway. Frank, you don't have to, I began. I want to, he interrupted. There's nothing left for me here. Ellen's gone. The farm's gone. He looked up at the vortex with something like longing. But I've seen their world. It's where I belong now. The entity's form shimmered, seeming to bow toward Frank. The choice is witnessed. The sacrifice accepted. What happened next defied description. The vortex expanded, encompassing our entire circle. The blue light surged, becoming so bright that we had to shield our eyes. Frank's body rose into the air, suspended at the center of the ritual site. His form began to change, to disperse, becoming one with the swirling energy. At the same time, the cattle around us, dozens of them, collapsed to the ground as if strings had been cut. The entities were abandoning their hosts, rushing toward the opening between worlds. The vortex reached its peak intensity, a column of blue light stretching from the ground to the stars above. Within it, I glimpsed countless forms, not quite physical, not quite energy, streaming upward, returning to their home dimension. And down that same column, something else descended, a single consciousness, separating from the collective, entering the body of Frank Harris even as his human consciousness departed. The exchange lasted only moments. Then, with a sound like thunder, the vortex collapsed in on itself. The blue lights winked out all at once. The temperature returned to normal. We stood in silence, our circle broken, staring at the center where Frank's body now lay still on the ground. Around us, cattle began to stir, returning to their feet, moving with the ordinary, aimless motions of normal livestock. Diana was the first to approach Frank. She knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. He's alive, she announced, surprised. Frank's eyes opened, but they were different somehow, deeper, older. When he spoke, His voice carried an echo of the many-layered tones we had heard before. "The exchange is complete," he said. "They have returned home. I remain as anchor." "Frank?" I asked hesitantly. He turned to me, his expression serene but alien. "Frank Harris has gone with them. I am what remains. What was promised." "What do we call you?" Diana asked. "I have no name in your language," the entity in Frank's body replied. "But you may continue to use the name of this vessel if it comforts you." We helped him to his feet. He moved awkwardly at first, as if testing the mechanics of his new form. His movements were careful and deliberate, like someone learning to walk again after a long illness. "How does it feel?" I asked, uncertain how to address this being that was no longer Frank but inhabited his body. "Limiting," he replied after a moment's consideration, "but freeing in its own way. To be singular rather than collective, it is a new experience." Diana stepped forward. "The ritual worked? They're truly gone?" "Yes," Not Frank confirmed. "The alignment created the path. The exchange maintained the balance. They have returned to their home dimension." Elena and Marion exchanged relieved glances. Jim simply stared at the ground where, moments before, a portal to another world had opened. "And the cattle?" I asked, watching as my herd began to drift away, returning to their normal patterns. "They are just cattle now," he said. "Vessels emptied of their temporary inhabitants. They will remember nothing of what they carried." As we stood there, the first light of dawn began to creep over the eastern horizon. The night had passed, though it felt like we had existed outside of time during the ritual. "What happens now?" Marion asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. Not Frank considered this. "I will learn to exist in this form. I will observe and understand your world as my kind once observed and understood yours." "And you'll stay, where?" Jim asked pragmatically. "The vessel, Frank, owned property," the entity replied. "I will remain there. I require little." "You can't just live alone out there," I protested. "People will notice something's different." "I can help," Diana offered. "My grandmother's research, she prepared for this possibility. She left notes about helping an entity adjust to human existence." Not Frank nodded gratefully. "The transition will be challenging. Assistance would be welcomed." As the sun rose higher, we began to disperse. Elena and Marion returned to their farms, shaken but relieved. Jim hesitated, then offered to help Diana get Not Frank settled at the Harris property. I lingered at the ritual site, watching as the morning dew gathered on the grass that had been frozen with otherworldly frost just hours before. The ground beneath my feet showed no sign of the incredible energies that had coursed through it. No vitrified soil, no scorched earth. This time, the ritual had gone as intended. Before Diana left with Not Frank, she approached me one last time. "It's over," she said quietly. "The cycle that began thousands of years ago has ended." "Has it?" I asked. "Or has it just changed? We still have one of them here." Diana smiled faintly. "My grandmother believed that was always the intention. That we weren't meant to just help them leave, but to establish a connection between our worlds. A translator. An ambassador." I looked over at Not Frank, who was examining a wildflower with intense curiosity. "And what happens when people realize he's not human?" "They won't," Diana said confidently. "He'll learn. And we'll help him." That's our part of the bargain now. As I drove back to my ranch, exhaustion finally catching up with me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, not just for the 7 of us who had served as conduits, but for the world itself. A door had been opened, then closed, but not locked. A connection had been established. I arrived home to find my cow grazing peacefully in the morning light. No strange formations, no unexplained deaths, no ethereal blue glow. Just ordinary animals going about their ordinary lives. Yet as I watched them, I couldn't help but wonder what other cosmic travelers might be hiding in plain sight around us, waiting for their chance to go home. 3 months passed. Winter settled over the county, bringing with it a peaceful quiet that seemed to reflect the new order of things. My cattle remained cattle, docile, predictable, blessedly silent in my mind. The nightmares that had plagued me faded, replaced by occasional dreams of blue stars and distant plains under alien skies. Diana and I visited Not Frank regularly. His adjustment to human life was proceeding better than any of us had expected. He had an insatiable curiosity about everything, from the mechanics of cooking breakfast to the intricacies of human social interactions. Diana's grandmother's notes proved invaluable, providing guidance on everything from managing human emotions to navigating community suspicions. "Your grandmother seems to have predicted everything," I remarked to Diana one evening as we sat on Frank's porch, watching Not Frank attempt to chop wood with methodical precision. "Not everything," Diana said, her breath visible in the cold air. She never anticipated that the entity would be so adaptable, so eager to embrace humanity. Indeed, Not Frank had begun to develop his own unique personality, one that blended aspects of the original Frank Harris with something entirely other. He spoke more now, his sentences losing their formal, stilted quality. He had even begun to refer to himself as Frank, but we all knew he was something else entirely. Jim Whitaker had become something of a mentor to him, teaching him practical skills and the gruff vernacular of rural life. Elena brought him baked goods and taught him to garden. Marian helped him understand human emotions through music and art. And I found myself teaching him about the cattle, the very creatures his kind had inhabited for millennia. "Why do you care for them?" he asked me one day as we mended fences. "They are not intelligent. Not as your kind measures intelligence. They are living beings," I explained. "They depend on us. There's a responsibility there." He nodded thoughtfully. "A symbiosis. Like what my kind had with them, but different." "Very different," I agreed. "Your kind was using them. We're caring for them. The distinction is important to you," he observed. "It should be important to everyone." The winter months brought other changes as well. The story of the ritual and what had happened that night remained between the 7 of us, 6 humans and 1 entity in human form. We agreed that the truth would bring nothing but trouble. Instead, we created a simpler narrative. Frank Harris had returned to his property after a difficult period following his wife's departure. He was keeping to himself, adjusting to life alone. His sometimes odd behavior was attributed to the emotional toll of his loss. Most people in the county accepted this explanation without question. A few raised eyebrows at Frank's transformation from the angry, bitter man they had known to the curious, thoughtful individual he had become, but no one pressed the issue. Life continued. The cow markets fluctuated. Weather patterns shifted. Politics dominated the news. In the face of ordinary life, our extraordinary experience seemed increasingly dreamlike, a shared hallucination that only the 7 of us remembered. Until the day the blue lights returned. It was a Tuesday in late February. I was checking fences along the north pasture when I noticed a faint glow emanating from the old barn, the same barn where I had first heard the entities speak my name. My heart raced as I approached, a complex mix of fear and anticipation churning in my stomach. I pushed open the door, wincing at the familiar creak of rusty hinges. Inside, hovering about 3 feet off the ground, was a small blue light, not the thousands I had seen during the ritual, but a single, pulsing orb that seemed to notice my presence immediately. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish even as I did so. The light brightened slightly, then dimmed. It moved closer to me, circling my head once before settling in front of my face. "What are you?" I whispered. "Are you one of them? Did you get left behind?" The light pulsed 3 times in quick succession, then drifted toward the door, pausing as if waiting for me to follow. Against my better judgment, I did. The light led me across the pasture, over the creek, and into the woods beyond my property. We walked for nearly an hour before reaching a clearing I didn't recognize, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by towering pines. In the center of the clearing stood Frank. "I see you've met our visitor," he said calmly as I approached. "What is it?" I demanded. "I thought they all left." "They did," Frank confirmed. "This is something else. A messenger." The blue light bobbed in agreement, then expanded, forming a small, shimmering portal no larger than a dinner plate. Through it, I could see a glimpse of that other world, the vast plains, the strange sky. "They wish to express gratitude," Frank explained, "and to offer a gift." "What kind of gift?" I asked warily. Frank smiled, a genuine, human smile that still looked slightly unpracticed on his face. "Knowledge. Understanding. A glimpse of what exists beyond the boundaries of your world." The light pulsed again, and suddenly, I understood. It wasn't just a messenger, it was an invitation. "They want me to go there?" I asked, incredulous. "Not permanently," Frank clarified. "Just a visit. A brief exchange, like the one that brought me here. A chance to see what the entities saw when they looked through the eyes of your cattle." I stared at the portal, at the alien landscape beyond. Part of me wanted to flee, to return to the safe, ordinary world I had known before any of this began. But another part, the part that had looked up at the stars as a child and wondered what lay beyond, urged me forward. "Will I be able to come back?" I asked. Frank nodded. "The path remains open, though narrow. What was done cannot be undone entirely. There will always be a connection now." I took a deep breath, considering. "Have you told the others? Diana, Jim, Elena, Marianne?" "They will receive their own messengers," Frank said. "Their own invitations. And if we refuse?" "Then you refuse," Frank said simply. "It is a gift, not a demand. A chance to witness, not an obligation." I looked at the small blue portal, at the world beyond that had once been home to the entities that had inhabited my cattle. I thought about the choice Frank Harris had made to leave this world behind for another. I wasn't ready for that. But a visit? A glimpse? How long? I asked. "Time moves differently there," Frank admitted. "But the messenger will ensure your return before you are missed." I nodded slowly, decision made. "I'll do it. But I want to talk to Diana first. And the others." Frank smiled again, more naturally this time. "Of course. The messenger will wait." As we walked back to my property, the blue light following silently behind us, I found myself wondering what this new chapter would bring. The entities had gone home, but the connection remained. A door had been opened between worlds, and now, it seemed, an exchange of travelers had begun. What would I see on the other side? What would I learn? And more importantly, what would I bring back with me? The blue light pulsed gently, as if sensing my thoughts. Whatever lay ahead, I knew that the night of the ritual hadn't been an ending, but a beginning. The story of the Star Spirits and the cattle ranchers of Blackwood County was far from over. It was, in fact, just getting started. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the places we walk every day? What secrets the earth keeps hidden just a few feet below our unsuspecting steps? The cold Minnesota wind bit at my face as I trudged through the newly fallen snow, making my way back to the construction site where I worked as a geological surveyor. My name is Daniel Reeves, and I had been contracted to perform preliminary assessments for a new shopping complex on the outskirts of St. Cloud. There was nothing remarkable about this job, or so I thought until that fateful Tuesday afternoon in late November. The site was quiet when I arrived. Most of the crew had gone home early due to the unexpected snowfall, leaving behind only the low hum of generators and the occasional creak of metal from the excavators. As I approached the main dig site, I noticed something odd. Tom, the foreman, was standing motionless at the edge of the excavation, staring down with an expression I couldn't quite read from a distance. "Tom?" I called out, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Everything all right?" He didn't respond immediately. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, almost ashen. "You need to see this, Dan," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "We hit something while digging the foundation trench. Something that shouldn't be here." A prickle of unease crawled up my spine as I approached. The excavation was about 15 feet deep, with freshly dug earth piled high around the edges. Tom pointed toward a corner where the backhoe had exposed something that gleamed dully in the fading afternoon light. Metal. Old, rusted metal beams forming an unmistakable structure. "Is that a bridge?" I asked, incredulous. "Looks like it," Tom nodded. "An old iron bridge, like the kind you'd see crossing a river. Except there's no river here. Never was, according to all the surveys and historical records." I squinted down at the partially exposed structure. It was indeed a small iron bridge, perhaps 20 feet in length, with ornate railings and what appeared to be old-fashioned lamp posts at either end. The style suggested late 19th century, but what was most disturbing was how perfectly preserved it seemed despite being completely buried. "We need to get down there," I said, already reaching for my hard hat and flashlight. Tom grabbed my arm. "The weird thing is, Dan, when we first uncovered it about an hour ago, one of those old lamps was lit. Actually lit, with a flame inside the glass. It went out as we watched." I laughed nervously. "That's impossible." "I know what I saw," Tom said flatly. 20 minutes later, I was carefully making my way down the makeshift ramp to the bottom of the excavation. The temperature seemed to drop with each step deeper into the earth. By the time my boots touched the ground near the exposed bridge, my breath hung visibly in the air despite being sheltered from the wind. The bridge was even more remarkable up close. Gothic-inspired ironwork curved gracefully along its sides, and the lampposts were intricately designed with spirals and what looked like faces, or were they masks, carved into the metal. The strangest thing was that while everything else was covered in dirt and clay, the bridge itself seemed almost clean, as though something had been preventing the earth from fully claiming it. I ran my gloved hand along the railing. The metal was ice cold, colder than it should have been, even considering the November chill. Something else struck me as odd. There was no vibration from the generators running above, no distant rumble of traffic from the highway less than a mile away. It was as if the bridge existed in its own pocket of silence. "Tom?" I called up, my voice sounding strangely muffled. "Can you give me the measuring tape and the camera?" No response came from above. "Tom?" I tried again, louder this time. The silence that answered me was complete. Even the ambient sounds of the construction site had vanished. It was then that I noticed something that made my heart stutter. One of the lampposts at the far end of the bridge had a faint glow emanating from within its glass enclosure. A trick of the light, I told myself. Or maybe the reflection from my flashlight. But as I stood there, the glow intensified, growing from a dim flicker to a steady yellowish flame. Not electric, an actual flame, as though someone had just lit an oil lamp. Logic told me to climb back up and out of this hole. To get Tom, to call someone, to document this properly. But a stronger impulse drew me toward the bridge. I needed to understand what I was seeing, to make sense of something that defied explanation. My first step onto the metal decking of the bridge produced a hollow, resonant sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. The second step came with a sensation of pressure in my ears, like descending quickly in an airplane. By the third step, I was fully on the bridge, and the strangest feeling overcame me, weightlessness combined with the certainty that I was being watched. The bridge didn't lead anywhere. Both ends terminated in solid earth. Yet somehow, standing on it, I had the vertigo-inducing impression that I was suspended over an immense void. My flashlight beam, when I directed it toward either end of the bridge, seemed to travel much farther than it should have before being swallowed by darkness. Then I heard it, a sound like distant footsteps, coming from somewhere beyond the far end of the bridge where the lamp was now burning brightly. Measured, deliberate steps, growing closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The footsteps paused. In the silence that followed, I could hear something else, a faint mechanical clicking, like the workings of an antique clock. Then came a voice, or something like a voice. It didn't seem to travel through the air so much as form directly inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. "You shouldn't be here yet," it said. "Your crossing isn't scheduled." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. The lamp at the other end of the bridge suddenly flared, becoming painfully bright. In its glare, I thought I could see a silhouette, tall and unnaturally thin, with something wrong about the proportions of its head and limbs. "The bridgekeeper maintains the schedule," the voice continued. "You must return. Your time is not now." My back hit the railing. I was breathing too fast, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silhouette took a step forward, onto the bridge. The metal beneath my feet began to vibrate subtly, and I could have sworn I heard the sound of rushing water from somewhere far below. "What is this place?" I managed to ask, but my mouth was dry with fear. "What are you?" The figure took another step. The light behind it shifted, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something that looked like a face, but not a human face. It had too many features, arranged in a configuration that made my eyes hurt and my brain rebel. "This bridge spans the gap between," came the reply. "Between what was and what will be. Between the surface and the depths. Between life and what follows." Terror gave me clarity. Whatever this was, whatever impossible thing was happening, I needed to get away. I turned to run back the way I had come, but froze in horror. The entrance to the bridge was gone. Where there had been excavated earth and construction equipment, there was now only darkness, with faint lights twinkling in the distance like stars. Or perhaps like more lamps on more bridges stretching away into infinity. I whirled back around. The figure was closer now, close enough that I could see its hands, long-fingered appendages that ended in what looked like small tools rather than fingernails. Tools that gleamed metallically in the lamplight. "You found us too soon," it said, and I detected something like regret in its impossible voice. "The schedule must be maintained. But now that you stepped onto the crossing, arrangements must be made." My legs gave out, and I sank to my knees on the cold iron of the bridge. The vibration beneath me was stronger now, and the sound of rushing water had become a roar. The air around me seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. "Please," I gasped. "I don't understand." The figure stood directly before me now, blocking out the light from the lamp. Its shadow fell over me like a physical weight. "You will," it said simply. "All crossers eventually understand. That is the purpose of the bridges." It reached for me with those terrible tool hands. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me began to spin, the darkness closing in from all sides. The last thing I remembered before losing consciousness was the figure leaning down, its face, if you could call it that, coming into focus. And as darkness claimed me, I had one final, horrifying thought. I recognized that face. It was mine, but changed, altered, as though someone had taken my features and rearranged them according to some alien geometry. Then there was nothing. I woke to the sound of Tom's voice and the jarring sensation of being shaken. "Dan. Jesus Christ, Dan. Can you hear me?" My eyes fluttered open. I was lying on my back at the bottom of the excavation, the gray Minnesota sky visible as a rectangle far above. Tom's worried face hovered over mine, and behind him stood two paramedics. "What happened?" I croaked, my throat painfully dry. "You fell," Tom said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Or something." I turned away for maybe 30 seconds to get the equipment you asked for, and when I looked back, you were collapsed on the ground next to that damn bridge. The memory came flooding back, the lamp lighting itself, the figure on the bridge, the voice in my head. I tried to sit up too quickly and was rewarded with a wave of dizziness. "Easy there," one of the paramedics cautioned, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. "You might have a concussion." "How long was I out?" I asked. Tom and the paramedics exchanged glances. "Almost 3 hours," Tom finally said. "We couldn't wake you. It was like you were in some kind of trance." 3 hours? It had felt like minutes on the bridge. I turned my head to look at the structure that had started this nightmare and froze. The bridge was different. Where before there had been ornate Gothic ironwork, now the railings were simpler, more utilitarian. The lampposts were gone entirely. It looked like a completely different bridge, or rather, like the same bridge stripped of its more distinctive features. "Tom," I said carefully, "does the bridge look different to you?" He gave me a strange look. "Different how?" "It's just an old iron footbridge. Weird place for it, but nothing special about it." He didn't remember. Or he was seeing something different than what I had seen before. I decided not to press the issue, not until I understood what was happening. The paramedics insisted on taking me to the hospital for observation. I had no physical injuries beyond a small cut on my hand that I didn't remember getting, but my blood pressure was unusually low, and they were concerned about my period of unconsciousness. Tom promised to secure the site until I returned. At the hospital, the doctors found nothing wrong with me beyond mild dehydration. They kept me overnight as a precaution, and I was released the following morning with instructions to rest and avoid strenuous activity for a few days. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove straight to the St. Cloud Historical Society. If that bridge had been built underground, there had to be records of it somewhere, or at least some local history that might explain its presence. The Historical Society was housed in a Victorian-era mansion that had once belonged to one of the city's founding families. I spent hours poring through old maps, construction records, and newspaper archives, finding nothing relevant until late in the afternoon when I stumbled across a small article from 1897. "Mysterious Disappearance Baffles Local Authorities," read the headline. The article detailed the case of Edward Merrick, a bridge engineer who had vanished without trace while working on a revolutionary new design for a river crossing. His workshop had been found abandoned, his tools and drafting materials left behind as though he had simply walked away in the middle of his work. What caught my attention was the location of Merrick's workshop, less than a quarter-mile from our construction site. As I dug deeper, I found more disappearances over the years, all within the same small radius, all unexplained. In 1912, a surveyor for the railroad. In 1945, 2 children who had been playing in a field. In 1978, a geology professor from the local university. The list went on, approximately 1 disappearance every 20 to 30 years, always without explanation, always from that same area. My hands were shaking by the time I finished my research. It was already dark outside, the short winter day having passed while I was lost in historical records. I should have gone home. I should have called Tom and told him to fill in that excavation and forget about building anything there. Instead, I found myself driving back to the construction site. The place was deserted when I arrived, the work halted due to my accident. Yellow caution tape surrounded the excavation, fluttering in the night breeze. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the dark hole in the ground, gathering my courage. What was I doing here? What did I hope to find? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I needed answers, needed to understand what had happened to me on that bridge, and why I seemed to be the only one who had seen it as it truly was. Finally, I got out of the car. The temperature had dropped further, and frost crunched under my boots as I approached the edge of the excavation. I played my flashlight beam down into the darkness, illuminating the partially exposed bridge below. Even from here, I could see that it had changed again. The ornate features were back, the Gothic ironwork, the decorative lampposts. And one of those lamps was lit, casting a warm yellow glow that had no business existing in an electric age. I knew I should leave. Every instinct screamed danger. But something pulled at me, a compulsion I couldn't resist. Before I fully realized what I was doing, I was climbing down the same ramp I had used yesterday, descending toward the bridge and its impossible light. The silence enveloped me again as I reached the bottom, that unnatural absence of sound that seemed to swallow even my own footsteps. The air was colder here, my breath forming dense clouds that hung suspended before my face as if the normal movement of air had been suspended. The bridge waited, bathed in the soft glow of a single-lit lamp. As I approached, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the base of the lamp post was a small metal door, like the access panel for an electrical box, but clearly much older in design. My fingers trembled as I reached for it. The metal was freezing to the touch, burning my skin with cold, but the little door swung open easily, revealing a small compartment within the base of the lamp post. Inside was a book, a ledger bound in what looked like dark leather, its edges worn smooth with age and handling. I removed it carefully and opened it to find pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. Dates and names, hundreds of them, stretching back centuries. Each entry included a date, a name, and a brief notation that looked like a time, 24-hour format, down to the second. With growing horror, I flipped through the pages until I reached the most recent entries. And there, at the bottom of the right-hand page, was my own name, Daniel Reeves. Next to it was yesterday's date and what I assumed was the exact time I had first set foot on the bridge. But unlike the other entries, mine was followed by a question mark and the word premature in red ink. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the entry directly above mine, Edward Merrick, September 10th, 1897. The bridge engineer who had disappeared. And above him, all the others I had read about in the historical records, along with hundreds more I hadn't discovered. This was a schedule. A crossing schedule. The realization hit me with physical force, driving the air from my lungs. Whatever this bridge was, wherever it led, people had been crossing it, willingly or not, for centuries. And somehow, I had stumbled onto it prematurely, outside of whatever terrible system governed these crossings. A scraping sound behind me made me whirl around, nearly dropping the ledger. There was nothing there, just the empty excavation and the dark ramp leading back to the surface. But when I turned back to the bridge, I froze. The lamp that had been lit moments before was now dark. Instead, the lamp at the opposite end of the bridge glowed with an eerie intensity, casting long shadows across the ironwork. The ledger in my hand suddenly felt heavier, as if the weight of all those names, all those souls, was pressing down on me. I knew I should flee, climb back up that ramp and never return. But the bridge exerted its pull, a gravitational force I couldn't resist. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. The metal beneath my feet hummed with subtle vibration, almost like a living thing. As I approached the center of the bridge, the sound of rushing water returned, not from below, but from all around me, as if the bridge existed in some impossible space between worlds. "You've returned," came that voice again, bypassing my ears to form directly in my mind. Earlier than expected, but perhaps that is for the best. The figure emerged from the darkness beyond the lit lamp. In the pale glow, I could see it more clearly now, a form that was almost human but distorted as if viewed through rippling water. Its limbs were too long, its proportions wrong in ways that defied description. And its face was a shifting collage of features, some recognizably mine, others belonging to people I didn't know. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am the bridge keeper," it replied. "I maintain the schedule, ensure the crossings occur as ordained." "These people," I said, holding up the ledger with trembling hands. "Where did they go? Where does this bridge lead?" The bridge keeper tilted its impossible head. "All bridges connect 2 points," it said, as if explaining something simple to a child. "This one connects your world to what lies beneath." "Beneath what?" "Beneath everything." The bridge keeper gestured widely. "There are layers to existence, Daniel Reeves. Your world is but the topmost layer, the surface tension on a much deeper pool. Some must travel down, so that others may rise." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. "Those people in the ledger, they're dead, aren't they?" "Death is your word," the bridge keeper said. "It is imprecise. They have transitioned to a deeper layer of existence. as all must, eventually. I backed away, clutching the ledger to my chest. And me? What happens to me? You present a problem, the bridge keeper said, following me as I retreated. Your crossing was premature. The schedule has been disrupted. I'm not crossing anything, I said, my back now pressed against the opposite railing. I'm leaving. Now. The bridge keeper's two hands clicked together, a sound like small metal instruments being sorted. The schedule must be maintained, it said. But there are alternatives. Before I could respond, the bridge keeper reached out and touched the ledger I was holding. The book fell open, pages flipping rapidly as if caught in a strong wind, before settling on a blank page near the end. Every bridge requires a keeper, the creature said. Mine has been a long tenure. Perhaps it is time for another to take my place. Understanding dawned with horrifying clarity. No, I said, trying to drop the ledger, but my fingers wouldn't obey. No, I won't. The choice is rarely offered, the bridge keeper said, something like sadness in its impossible voice. It is either this or the crossing, Daniel Reeves. Become the keeper or join those who have passed beneath. The bridge began to transform around us. The metal railings elongated and twisted, forming complex patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. The lamps multiplied, stretching into infinity in both directions. And beneath us, the sound of rushing water became a deafening roar. Decide, the bridge keeper commanded, its form beginning to flicker like a candle flame in the wind. In that moment, I thought of all those names in the ledger, centuries of people who had crossed this bridge, never to return to the world above. I thought of Tom, who would find this excavation empty tomorrow. I thought of my life, my work, everything I would leave behind. And I made my choice. 3 weeks later, Tom Hendricks stood at the edge of the excavation, watching as the last of the concrete was poured into the foundation. The discovery of the old iron bridge had delayed construction by nearly a month, but they were back on schedule now. Shame about Dan, said the project manager, coming to stand beside him. Any word from the police? Tom shook his head. Nothing. They found his car here that night, but no sign of him. It's like he just vanished. Weird coincidence, the manager mused. Finding that old bridge, then disappearing near it. Yeah, Tom agreed, though he didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Not since that night when he found Dan unconscious beside the bridge, not since he'd seen, if only for a moment, the lamp that shouldn't have been lit. The concrete truck pulled away, and Tom turned to go. As he did, he caught movement from the corner of his eye, a flicker of something at the edge of the newly poured foundation. He paused, squinting into the gathering dusk. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing there, tall and thin, with strangely elongated limbs and a familiar yet distorted face. Then it was gone, leaving only the wind and the fading light and the uneasy feeling that something was watching from just beyond the veil of ordinary reality. Tom shivered and hurried to his truck. As he drove away from the construction site, he couldn't shake the sensation that he was being followed by the sound of measured footsteps and the faint, metallic clicking of tools. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of something impossible, a warm yellow glow where no light should be, like an antique lamp burning in the darkness. He drove faster, never looking back again. And beneath the newly poured foundation, beneath the layers of concrete and rebar and earth, the bridge remained, connecting the world above to whatever lay beneath, waiting for the next name on its schedule. Have you ever felt like a place was watching you? Not the people in it, but the building itself? The Waverly Grand Hotel stood like a forgotten aristocrat at the edge of Jefferson City, Missouri, once elegant, now merely holding on to memories of its former glory. I'd taken the job as the night manager out of desperation more than anything else. 3 months unemployed had a way of making even the most decrepit workplace seem appealing, especially one that offered lodging as part of the compensation. "You have the 3rd floor east wing to yourself," Mr. Reynolds, Mrs. Blackwood, the elderly owner, had explained during my interview. Not many guests these days, but we maintain standards. The night shift is quiet, just answer any guest calls, do hourly security walks, and report anything unusual. That last instruction would return to haunt me in ways I couldn't imagine. My first night began ordinarily enough. The hotel lobby retained echoes of its 1920s grandeur, crystal chandeliers hanging from ornate ceilings, mahogany reception desk polished to a mirror shine, and marble floors that carried sounds with an almost musical resonance. But beneath the elegance lay unmistakable decay, water stains darkening corners of the ceiling, carpets threadbare along the main pathways, and a perpetual musty scent that no amount of cleaning seemed to eliminate. The Waverly housed only 11 guests that night, mostly business travelers who barely glanced at me during check-in. By midnight, the hotel had fallen into that peculiar silence unique to large, mostly empty buildings, a silence that seemed to have substance, like pressure against my eardrums. I was completing my 1 o'clock patrol when I first noticed something odd. Turning into the 2nd floor corridor, my flashlight beam caught a strange reflection on the polished wood floor ahead. Drawing closer, I realized what I was seeing, a perfect handprint. Not dust or dirt, but moisture, as if someone had pressed a wet palm deliberately against the floor. I crouched down, puzzled. The print was small, possibly a child's, though we had no children registered as guests. The moisture glistened under my flashlight. I touched it cautiously with my fingertip, cold water, nothing more. Housekeeping must have missed a spot during cleaning, I reasoned, making a mental note to mention it in the morning. By 2 o'clock, I had nearly forgotten about the handprint. I was updating the guest registry when a sound drew my attention, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere above. Footsteps, perhaps, though unusual at this hour. I listened intently, tracking the sound as it moved across the ceiling overhead, then stopped. The silence that followed felt charged, expectant. My 3 o'clock patrol took me back to that same 2nd floor corridor. I swept my flashlight ahead out of habit, then froze mid-step. Where there had been a single handprint before, now a trail of wet prints stretched down the hallway, left hand, right hand, left hand, as if someone had crawled along the floor. The nearest print still glistened with moisture. I couldn't recall hearing anyone in this corridor. The prints hadn't been there 2 hours ago, and no guests had called the front desk. The logical explanation was that someone had gotten up for ice or a vending machine visit, spilled something, and returned to their room. But why crawl? And why leave no footprints alongside? I knelt to examine the prints more closely. That's when I noticed they led directly to room 217, a room that Mrs. Blackwood had specifically mentioned was under renovation and unoccupied. A shiver ran through me as I realized something else. The prints didn't lead away from the room, only toward it. Against my better judgment, I approached room 217. The door was locked, as expected. I pressed my ear against the wood but heard nothing. After a moment's hesitation, I used my master key, telling myself I was simply performing my duty. The door swung open onto darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, finding it with trembling fingers. Harsh fluorescent light revealed a half-renovated room, plastic sheeting, paint cans, drop-cloth-covered furniture. No one was there, but the window stood open, curtains swaying gently in the night breeze. The room was empty, yet something felt profoundly wrong. The air seemed thicker, cooler than the corridor outside. I moved to close the window, stepping carefully across the drop cloth. That's when I saw it, a final wet handprint on the windowsill. As I stared, the moisture slowly changed color before my eyes, darkening from clear to pinkish red. I backed out of the room, closed the door, and returned to the front desk on unsteady legs. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation, rust in the water pipes, perhaps, or a trick of light on moisture. But deep down, a primal part of me recognized what I'd seen for what it was. Blood. The digital clock on the desk flicked over to 3:30. My next patrol was due at 4. Already, I dreaded what I might find. What would you do if the impossible kept happening, night after night? I convinced myself I'd been overtired that first night. The handprints must have been water from a leaking pipe, the color change a trick of the fluorescent lighting. When morning came and my replacement arrived, I didn't mention the incident. What would I say? That I'd seen crawling handprints leading to an empty room? That I'd watched water transform into blood? I returned to my quarters and fell into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of wet palms pressing against my bedroom door. My second night began with a determination to be more observant, more rational. I methodically checked every corridor during my first patrol at 10 o'clock, paying special attention to the second floor. The floors were spotless. Room 217 remained locked and undisturbed. The hotel felt different tonight, colder despite the mild April weather outside. The emptiness of the vast corridors seemed more pronounced, as if the building were holding its breath. We had fewer guests than the previous night, only 7 rooms occupied, all on the first floor. The place has history. Fernando, the elderly maintenance man, had told me during our brief shift overlap. Built in 1924. Used to be the grandest hotel between St. Louis and Kansas City. Any ghost stories? I'd asked, attempting humor while fishing for information. Fernando had given me a long, appraising look. Every old hotel has stories, Mr. Reynolds. Question is which ones you choose to believe. He'd left before I could ask any follow-up questions. At midnight, I began my second patrol. Everything remained normal until I reached the 3rd floor, my floor, where my own quarters were located at the far end of the east wing. As I turned the corner into the main corridor, my flashlight beam caught a reflection on the carpet. A wet handprint. Small, like a child's. Then another. And another. Unlike last night's prints, these didn't form a crawling pattern. These were scattered randomly, as if someone had been touching the carpet while dancing or playing. All were wet, glistening in the harsh beam of my flashlight. I knelt to examine one, forcing my hand not to tremble. Water again, nothing more. I touched it, cold, so cold it almost burned my fingertip. A noise from down the hall made me jerk upright, a soft thud, like something heavy dropping onto carpet. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing only the empty corridor stretching before me. Another sound followed, a dragging, sliding noise. Hello? My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the thick carpet and heavy silence. Is someone there? No response, but the dragging continued, moving away from me now. I followed slowly, my duty battling with growing dread. The sound led me toward the west wing, toward room 338. Hotel management, I called, with more confidence than I felt. Is everything all right? The dragging stopped. Silence fell, heavier than before. I reached room 338 and found the door slightly ajar. According to our records, this room should be vacant, undergoing minor repairs to fix water damage from a leaking shower. I pushed the door open with my flashlight. Hello? The room was dark except for moonlight filtering through partially open curtains. It appeared empty, bed made, bathroom door open, revealing darkness beyond. I reached for the light switch. Before my fingers found it, a sound came from directly behind me, a wet, squelching noise like sodden clothes being wrung out. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Nothing. Hard hammering, I backed into the room, unwilling to turn my back on the empty corridor. My heel struck something wet. Looking down, I saw a fresh handprint on the carpet, the moisture slowly seeping outward. As I watched, paralyzed, another print appeared beside it, materializing as if an invisible hand were pressing down into the carpet. Then another, and another. Prints forming in sequence, moving toward me in a deliberate path. I don't remember running. Somehow I found myself back at the front desk, gasping for breath, the radio clutched in my shaking hand. I nearly called the police before reason reasserted itself. What would I report? I had seen nothing, no intruder, no actual threat. Just handprints appearing from nowhere. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. Stress. An overactive imagination combined with old pipes and water damage. There had to be a rational explanation. At 3 o'clock, I forced myself to continue my patrol duties. The third-floor corridor was now completely dry, no evidence of the wet prints I'd seen earlier. Room 338 was locked and undisturbed, as if I'd imagined the entire incident. I almost convinced myself I had, until I returned to the lobby and saw the desk. Across the polished mahogany surface where I'd been sitting all night, a trail of small handprints glistened wetly. They led across the counter to the guest registry, where the book lay open to that night's entries. In the space where room numbers were recorded, a wet smear partially obscured the writing. As I stared, the moisture on the final handprint began to darken, turning rusty brown before my eyes. The smell hit me a moment later, metallic, unmistakable. Blood. I flipped frantically through the registry, searching for a clue, any connection to what was happening. On a page dated April 1958, something caught my eye. Room 217 had been occupied by the Wilson family. A note in the margin, written in faded ink, incident reported. Room to be permanently sealed. What incident? What had happened in that room 67 years ago? The rest of my shift passed in tense vigilance. When my replacement arrived at 6, I said nothing about the handprints. Instead, I asked a casual question about the hotel's history. You should talk to Mrs. Blackwood if you're interested in that stuff, he said with a shrug. Her family's owned this place since it was built. She knows all the stories. I nodded, already planning my approach. As I walked back to my quarters, exhaustion weighing my steps, I noticed something I'd overlooked during my patrol, a small, framed photograph hanging in a shadowed alcove. It showed the hotel in its prime, surrounded by vintage automobiles. In front stood a family, father, mother, and a small girl, perhaps 6 years old. The child was looking directly at the camera, her small hands raised as if in greeting. Small hands. Like the prints I'd been seeing. Sleep didn't come easily that day. Is it worse to face the unexplainable, or to learn that your fears have solid foundation? My third night at the Waverly began earlier than scheduled. I arrived at 4 in the afternoon, determined to speak with Mrs. Blackwood before she left for the day. I found her in her office, a small room behind the reception area cluttered with filing cabinets and faded photographs of the hotel through various decades. "Mr. Reynolds," she greeted me, peering over wire-rimmed glasses. "Is everything satisfactory with your accommodations?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I'm actually interested in learning more about the hotel's history." Her expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, caution, perhaps. "Any particular aspect?" "Room 217, I said, watching her closely. "I noticed it's under renovation." Her fingers still on the paperwork before her. "That room has been closed for many years. We're simply updating some electrical wiring as part of building code compliance." I saw a note in an old registry. Something about an incident in 1958. Mrs. Blackwood removed her glasses, folding them deliberately. "You've been going through the old records." "Just curious about the building's past," I said, trying to sound casual. The note mentioned the Wilson family. She sighed, suddenly looking older than her 70-plus years. "That was before my time. I was just a child then. My father was managing the hotel." "What happened?" She studied me for a long moment. "The Wilsons were guests during a severe storm. There was flooding in parts of the hotel, but plumbing was different then. Their daughter..." She paused. "Their daughter drowned in a bathtub. It was ruled an accident, but my father always believed there was more to the story." "More?" "The parents' accounts were inconsistent. There were signs the child had been..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully, held underwater. "But nothing was ever proven. They checked out immediately after. Room 217 was renovated and used for storage after that." A chill ran through me. "The child, do you remember her name?" "Eleanor," Mrs. Blackwood said softly. "Eleanor Wilson. She was 6 years old." I thought of the small handprints. "Are there other stories? Other incidents at the hotel?" Mrs. Blackwood's expression hardened. "Every old building has its share of tragedy, Mr. Reynolds. The Waverly has stood for over 100 years. People have lived and died here. Have you ever heard reports of unusual occurrences? From staff or guests?" She stood abruptly. "I should be going. My daughter is expecting me for dinner." "Mrs. Blackwood," I pressed, "have you ever seen anything yourself? Anything you couldn't explain?" She paused at the door, her back to me. After a long silence, she spoke without turning. "The 3rd floor, west corridor. Check the baseboards behind the water fountain." Then she was gone, the click of her sensible heels fading down the hallway. I spent the first hours of my shift pondering her cryptic instruction. At 10 o'clock, during my first patrol, I made my way to the 3rd floor west corridor. The water fountain stood in an alcove near the emergency stairs, an outdated model with a heavy metal basin. I crouched behind it, flashlight probing the shadowy space between the fountain and the wall. The baseboards here were different, newer wood that didn't quite match the surrounding paneling. I ran my fingers along the seam and felt a slight depression. Pressing firmly, the panel moved inward, then slid aside, revealing a small cavity in the wall. Inside lay a manila envelope, yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I withdrew it and carefully opened the sealed flap. Inside was a police report dated April 12, 1958, and several black and white photographs paper-clipped together. I skimmed the report, chest tightening as I read. The official cause of Eleanor Wilson's death was listed as accidental drowning, but the investigating officer had noted inconsistencies: bruising on the child's shoulders and upper arms, water on the bathroom floor that suggested a struggle, statements from hotel staff who reported hearing muffled screaming shortly before the body was discovered. Most damning was the final page, a handwritten addendum stating that both parents had been treated for scratches on their hands and forearms, which they attributed to their daughter's panic when they found her slipping underwater. The officer noted his suspicion that these were defensive wounds inflicted by the child. The photographs were worse. Clinical shots of the bathroom, the tub, and finally, my stomach lurched, the small body on the tiled floor. Eleanor Wilson lay on her back, dark hair plastered to her pale face, small hands curled slightly as if still trying to grasp something. In the final photo, someone had turned her palm upward, revealing deep scratches across the flesh, marks from her fingernails digging into her own skin. I returned everything to the envelope, hand shaking. Why had Mrs. Blackwood preserved these records? Why hide them behind the wall? My midnight patrol was conducted in a daze, my mind replaying the horrible images from the police report. I found myself avoiding the second floor entirely, taking the stairs directly from the lobby to the third floor. The hotel seemed to sense my unease. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. As I approached the water fountain where I'd found the hidden documents, I noticed something on the floor ahead. A small, wet handprint glistened in my flashlight beam. Beyond it, another. And another. The trail led away from the fountain, toward the east wing, toward my quarters. I followed, my rational mind still searching for explanations while something deeper, more primal, whispered that I already knew the truth. The handprints continued around the corner, growing closer together as if the person, the child, had moved from a crawl to a crouching position. They led directly to my door. I stood frozen, keys in hand, staring at the final handprint pressed against the wood just below the doorknob. As I watched, the moisture began to change color, darkening to a deep crimson. Blood welled from the print, running in thin rivulets down the door. Eleanor? I whispered, the name catching in my throat. The blood stopped flowing, pooling instead, beginning to form shapes, crude letters traced by an invisible finger. They hurt me. My knees nearly buckled. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. I know, I said, my voice barely audible. I saw the report. The blood shifted again, letters dissolving and reforming. Not safe. What's not safe? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The crimson letters tripped, reshaping. Here. A sound from behind me, wet, slapping footsteps. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The corridor was empty, but the handprints on the floor were changing, darkening like the one on my door. All across the hall, bloodied handprints now formed a chaotic pattern, as if a desperate struggle had taken place. I backed away, fumbling with my radio. Who would I call? What would I say? The handprints were appearing faster now, materializing from nothing, forming a trail that circled around me. A child's laughter echoed from somewhere distant, hollow, distorted, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The temperature plummeted so suddenly I could see my breath clouding before me. The flashlight flickered, dimmed, then died completely. In the absolute darkness, I felt something brush against my hand, small, cold fingers trying to grasp mine. I ran. Down the corridor, down the stairs, through the lobby, stopping only when I reached the front entrance. My hand was on the door when I realized I couldn't leave. I was the night manager. I have responsibilities. Guests were sleeping soundly in their rooms, unaware of what was happening above them. For long minutes, I stood trembling in the lobby, gathering my courage. The ornate clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, marking time as I fought to regain control of myself. When I finally returned to the third floor, armed with a fresh flashlight and what little courage I could muster, the corridor was clean. No handprints, no blood, no writing on my door. Even the wet footprints had vanished. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? I unlocked my door with shaking hands, half expecting to find my room transformed into a horrific scene. But everything was normal, bed made, possessions untouched. I collapsed onto the edge of the mattress, exhaustion and relief washing over me. That's when I noticed the bathroom door was closed. I hadn't left it that way. From behind the door came a sound, water running, splashing gently against porcelain. I should have fled. I should have run from the hotel and never looked back. Instead, drawn by some compulsion I couldn't name, I approached the bathroom door. My hand hesitated on the knob. The water sounds continued, joined now by something else, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like small fists weakly pounding against the inside of the tub. "Eleanor?" I whispered. The thumping stopped. The water stilled. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty. The tub was dry. No sign of water, no evidence of disturbance. I released a shuddering breath, sagging against the doorframe. Then I noticed the mirror. Written in the condensation that fogged the glass were 3 words. "They're still here." I staggered back to the bedroom, my mind racing. The Wilsons. Eleanor's parents. They couldn't still be alive after all these years, could they? And if they were, why would they be at the hotel? Unless they never left. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. I rushed to my laptop, fingers fumbling as I searched for information about the Wilson family. After several dead ends, I found a newspaper article from 1962, 4 years after Eleanor's death. The headline read, "Local couple perishes in house fire." According to the article, James and Meredith Wilson had died when their home burned down, the fire attributed to faulty wiring. The article mentioned they had been in seclusion since the tragic drowning of their daughter years earlier. If they had died in 1962, then who was Eleanor warning me about? The radio at my belt crackled suddenly, making me jump. A voice, my own replacement's, came through with static interference. "Mr. Reynolds? Are you there? We've got a situation in the lobby." I grabbed the radio. "What kind of situation?" "New guests checking in. Elderly couple, no reservation. They're insisting on room 217. Says they always stay there. How do you fight what shouldn't exist?" I raced downstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time, my mind reeling. Room 217, Eleanor's room, had been closed for over 60 years. Now an elderly couple was demanding to stay there? It couldn't be coincidence. The lobby was harshly lit after the darkness of the upper floors. My replacement, Tanner, a college student who usually worked weekend shifts, stood behind the reception desk looking uncomfortable. Across from him stood an elderly couple, the man tall and stooped, the woman small and bird-like. Both wore outdated clothing that seemed too formal for travel. "There you are," Tanner said with obvious relief. "These folks are asking for room 217, but the system shows it's under renovation." The elderly woman turned to me, her face creased with age, but her eyes startlingly clear. We always stay in that room, she said, her voice soft but insistent. Every year, on this night. I studied them carefully. The man appeared to be in his 80s, with thin white hair and gnarled hands that gripped the handle of a vintage leather suitcase. The woman was perhaps a few years younger, her silver hair arranged in an old-fashioned style. They couldn't possibly be the Wilsons. They would have been well over 100 years old. I'm sorry, I said, maintaining my professional demeanor despite the dread creeping up my spine. That room isn't available. We have several other lovely rooms I'd be happy to show you. It must be 217, the man spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly strong. We have sentimental reasons. May I ask your names? I inquired, moving behind the desk to check the registration system, though I already knew what I would find. James and Meredith Anderson, the woman answered smoothly. We've been coming to the Waverly for many years. Anderson, not Wilson. I felt a momentary relief, immediately followed by deeper suspicion. I typed the name into the system, searching past registrations. Nothing. No record of any Andersons staying at the hotel in the last 5 years. We don't have any record of your previous stays, I said carefully. Oh, it would have been before your computer system, Mr. Anderson replied with a dismissive wave. We're old-fashioned, you see. We prefer the personal touch of the past. Something about his phrasing made my skin crawl. I glanced at his hands, liver-spotted and wrinkled with age, but there was something off about them. The knuckles seemed too pronounced, the fingers too long. I'm afraid all our rooms require digital key cards now, I said, testing them. No traditional keys anymore. Mrs. Anderson's smile tightened. We're quite capable of adapting, young man. I looked at Tanner. Would you mind getting the luggage cart? I'll handle the registration. Once he was out of earshot, I leaned forward. Room 217 has been closed since 1958. Since Eleanor Wilson drowned in a bathtub. The change was instant and chilling. Mrs. Anderson's face hardened, her pleasant expression melting away. Mr. Anderson's posture shifted, becoming more rigid, more threatening. That room is ours, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's always been ours. Who are you? I demanded. You're not the Wilsons, they died decades ago. Mrs. Anderson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Names change. Bodies age and die. But some things remain. What do you want? To finish what we started, Mr. Anderson replied. His eyes, I noticed with growing horror, had changed, the irises expanding until they were almost entirely black. The girl escaped us. Her spirit has been troublesome. A chill ran through me. You killed her. We cleanse her, Mrs. Anderson corrected, her voice now harsh and grating. We've cleansed many over the years. But her attachment to that room has prevented us from completing our work. You're not staying in that room, I said firmly, though fear made my voice waver. You're not staying in this hotel at all. We've been invited, Mr. Anderson said, reaching into his jacket and producing an envelope. He slid it across the desk to me. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a hotel letterhead bearing Mrs. Blackwood's signature, confirming a reservation for the Andersons in room 217 for tonight's date. Mrs. Blackwood wouldn't do this, I said, though uncertainty crept into my voice. She knows the room is closed. Elizabeth Blackwood has her own reasons for allowing us access, Mrs. Anderson said with a smile that showed too many teeth. Family secrets run deep in this place. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Blackwood had directed me to the hidden police report. She had left me alone in the hotel knowing these people, these things, were coming. Was she trying to warn me, or was she part of whatever sinister purpose they served? I won't give you access to that room, I said, my decision made. Whatever you are, whatever you're planning, it stops now. Mr. Anderson's face contorted with anger, the skin stretching unnaturally. You have no authority here, boy. This hotel has served our purpose for generations. Tonight, we complete our work. His hand shot out, inhumanly fast, gripping my wrist. His touch was like ice, sending pain shooting up my arm. I tried to pull away but found myself paralyzed, unable to move or cry out. Mrs. Anderson moved around the desk, no longer walking like an elderly woman but gliding with unnatural smoothness. We could use you, she whispered, her breath cold against my ear. Your body is strong, young. It would serve us well. Through my paralysis, I noticed something on the floor behind them, a small, wet handprint appearing on the marble. Then another, and another, forming a trail that led from the elevator toward the reception desk. The Andersons sensed my attention shift. Mrs. Anderson turned, hissing as she saw the handprints. She's here. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, though no one had pressed the call button. Water began to pool out from the empty car, spreading across the lobby floor. Mr. Anderson's grip on my wrist tightened. Finish him, he commanded his wife. I'll deal with the spirit. Mrs. Anderson's hands moved toward my face, her fingers elongating, nails sharpening to points. I struggled against the paralysis, managing only the slightest twitch of my fingers. The water from the elevator was moving now, flowing not according to gravity but with purpose, streaming toward us like a living thing. It reached Mrs. Anderson's feet, swirling around her ankles. She screamed, a sound no human throat could produce, as the water began to climb her legs, soaking through her clothing. Where it touched, her skin seemed to dissolve, revealing something darker, more liquid beneath the human disguise. Mr. Anderson released me, rushing to his wife's aid. The moment his grip broke, I stumbled backward, crashing into the shelf of room keys behind the desk. Pain shot through my shoulder, but the paralysis was gone. The water continued to rise, now knee-deep around the Andersons. Their forms were changing, melting like wax figures in a fire, their elderly facades slowing away to reveal writhing, amorphous shapes beneath. Run. The voice was faint, childlike, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Run now. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the front entrance, yanking the doors open and plunging into the night. Behind me, inhuman shrieks echoed from the lobby, followed by the sound of rushing water. I ran until my lungs burned, stopping only when I reached the parking lot across the street. Turning back, I saw water pouring from the Waverly's entrance, cascading down the front steps like a miniature waterfall. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the hotel's exterior lights, was a small figure, a child in an old-fashioned dress, her dark hair hanging wet around her face. She raised a small hand in what might have been farewell. Then the lights went out, plunging the hotel into darkness. Did I tell you about the handprints that appear on the floor of the Waverly Grand Hotel? It's been 3 months since that night. 3 months of police investigations, insurance claims, and attempts to rebuild my life. No one believes what really happened, of course. The official report cites a catastrophic plumbing failure that flooded the entire first floor of the hotel. 2 bodies were recovered from the lobby, identified as James and Meredith Anderson, elderly tourists who had the misfortune to be checking in when the pipes burst. The autopsy findings were sealed by court order. The medical examiner quit his job a week later and moved to another state. I've tried to move on, to forget what I saw. But some nights I wake gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, the phantom sensation of cold fingers gripping my wrist. Mrs. Blackwood disappeared after that night. Her daughter reported her missing, but no trace was ever found. The Waverly remains closed, its future uncertain as ownership battles play out in court. I found a new job in another city, a small apartment where I sleep with the lights on. I've researched the Wilsons extensively, piecing together fragments of their history. What I've discovered chills me to the bone. James and Meredith Wilson weren't Eleanor's biological parents. They had adopted 5 children over the years, all of whom had died under mysterious circumstances. Eleanor was the last, and the only one whose death prompted any official investigation. But the trail goes deeper. The Wilsons had changed their names multiple times over the decades, appearing in different cities under different identities. Always childless, always adopting, always followed by tragedy. How far back did it go? How many children had they cleansed? And what were they, these entities that could change bodies, that could exist for decades beyond a human lifespan? I don't have all the answers. But I know this, Eleanor saved me that night. Whatever fragment of her spirit remained bound to that hotel, she used it to protect me from the same fate she had suffered. Last week, I received a package. No return address, no note inside. Just a manila envelope containing a faded photograph, the one I had seen hanging in the hotel alcove. The Waverly Grand in its heyday, with a family standing proud before it. The parents' faces had been burned away, leaving only charred holes. But the child's face remained intact, a small girl with solemn eyes and dark hair, her hands raised in what I now recognize was not a greeting, but a warning. I keep the photo in my desk drawer, unable to display it, but equally unable to throw it away. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I hear water running in the bathroom. I never go to check. But sometimes, in the morning, I find a single wet handprint on my bathroom floor. Small, like a child's. It never scares me though. I know it's Eleanor. Watching over me, warning me. The dream started last week. Not nightmares of drowning or cold fingers anymore, but visions of other places. Other hotels. In each one, I see families checking in, parents with too wide smiles and children with hollow eyes. And in each dream, I feel a pull, an urgency. Yesterday, I called in sick to work. I drove 4 hours to a seaside resort town where one of my dreams had led me. The Ocean View Hotel stood just as I had seen it, a Victorian building with peeling blue paint and a weathered sign. I checked in for one night, giving a false name. In the lobby, there they were. Different faces, different names, but I recognized them instantly. The same coldness in their eyes, the same predatory posture as they guided a small boy toward the elevator. Their son, they said, adopted just 3 months ago. I followed them discreetly, observing their routines. The parents never ate. The boy barely spoke. At night, I heard crying through the walls. I left an anonymous tip with local child services before departing. It won't be enough, it never is with beings like them. But it might buy the boy time. This morning, I found not one handprint, but 2 on my bathroom floor. Eleanor is not alone anymore. There are others. Children who were cleansed, whose spirits remain. I understand my purpose now. The package wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. The Wilson entities aren't unique. There are more of their kind, predators moving among us, changing identities, consuming innocence. I've given notice at my job. I've packed my life into one suitcase. The children lead me now, their handprints appearing in my dreams, guiding me to the next hotel, the next victim to save. I keep a journal of everything I learn. If something happens to me, it will find its way to someone who will continue the work. Perhaps even to you, dear reader. Listen for running water when it shouldn't be there. Watch for handprints that appear without explanation. And if you ever check into a hotel and see parents with two perfect smiles and eyes that never quite focus on you, run. The Wilsons weren't destroyed that night at the Waverly. They were merely dispersed, forced to start again elsewhere. But now they're being hunted. By me. By Eleanor. By all the children whose echoes remain. We are coming for them. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.